Hi guys, Mike Kenny here, and welcome back to the Pop Culture Playhouse. I'm very humbled and honored to have a great guest with us today. We have noted biographer Brian J. Jones. He's been responsible for such works such as Washington Irving, An American Original, Jim Henson, the Biography, which you can pick up the paperback version on May 5th, 2015, and currently he's working on the biography for George Lucas, so give a round of applause for Mr. Brian J. Jones. Brian, thank you for having the time to sit down with us.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Mike.
No problem. I just want to ask you right off the bat, after completing your work on your debut biography, Washington Irving, An American Original, how did the genesis of telling Jim Henson's story next occur?
Well, what happened there is, you're always supposed to be, while you're working on one, you're supposed to always be working on your next one at the same time. And the Irving book came out in January 8, and I was already talking with my agent, who's supposed to have your back and help you with these things, and my guy's great, about what to do next. And we were throwing around ideas, couldn't think anything, and somehow I remember being on Jim's Wikipedia page and reading through that, and as I found out over the next 5 years, Muppet fans are really great about citing things. Not every Wikipedia page is great at that, but the Muppet fans are great at that. And as I was reading through Jim's little bio on there, it's a pretty lengthy bio, I was reading stuff and going, well, I wonder where they got that. And so I would scroll down to the bottom and look at the citations, and everything was Jim Henson the Works and Jim Henson Designs and Doodle. It was all about Jim's work, as well it should be. But there was nothing that I saw that was biographical. There were a couple of kids, young adult biographies, but nothing on Jim. So I called my agent back. I'm going to give him a shout. His name's Jonathan Lyons. He works for Curtis Brown. He's a great guy. And I said, is there like a Robert Caro out there who's been writing about Jim for 20 years here? He's been dead 20 years. I can't believe no one's done this. Is there somebody that's been doing this as this huge project for 20 years? And he said, well, I don't know. Let me see what I can find out. So he started making calls, and I said, well, I'm going to see what I can find out. And I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is like the next county over from where Jim grew up.
Right.
And the University of Maryland's over the next county. So I went over to UMD to go talk to the archivist. There's an archivist that maintains sort of a film archive over there about it, about the biography. Was he working on one? I wanted to ask. A great guy named Vin Novara. And we talked for about 25 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour. And finally, I said, why is there no bio of Jim? And he said, that's a really great question. I don't know. And he gave me a contact inside the Jim Henson Legacy, which is a company that was established by Jane Henson and Arthur Novell and a number of business associates to focus just on Jim.
Right.
And the president at that time, the executive director, happened to be Arthur Novell, who was Jim's publicist during Jim's lifetime. And so I had Arthur's contact information, and I nursed an email for like 4 weeks.
Wow.
To send him, to sort of make the pitch on this.
Right.
And I sent the email finally, and I basically said, it's been 20 years now, and it's been a long time, and Bernie Brillstein had recently died, and Jerry Jewell had recently died. And so I was just basically saying, we've got sort of a ticking clock here. This is something we should probably start thinking about. I'm the right age for this. I'm Sesame Street Generation 1. I grew up with Jim's work, just trying to make the pitch. And Arthur wrote back almost immediately and sort of got it right away and said, this is really something we need to think about. Let's start the discussion.
Right.
And so we started talking with the Hensons. Jane was alive at the time. Jane just died last year. Or, I'm sorry, in 13. And so I would go meet with Jane over breakfast in New York, and we flew out to talk with Lisa out in Hollywood, and just sort of started this long discussion, sort of trying to get to know each other. The Hensons are a lot like Jim. They sort of have to have a good feeling about somebody they work with.
Right.
And we went back and forth a long time, and it was yes, and then it was no, and then it was maybe, and then it was yes again, and then it was let's think about it. We just went on and on and on. So finally, after about 2 years into this, I said, you guys are a Hollywood family. Let me give you an audition tape for this. And rather than do an actual video like this, I went to the Library of Congress and I pulled everything I could find from the newspapers during Jim's time working on Sam and Friends here in Washington, D.C. So I pulled every newspaper from Virginia and the 2 D.C. papers in Maryland, and I wrote sort of a sample chapter on Jim's time doing Sam and Friends in D.C. using stuff that had been written, using Jim Henson the Works and quotes in there and other stuff I found online, but also using those, those raw resources there. And I wrote about a 40-page chapter that, and actually a lot of that chapter is in the book, sort of in that I sent off to the Hensons. And I said, this is the way I would do this. This is the way I would use my resources. I want Jim to try to tell this as much as I can. And that sort of knocked it open. At that point, they said, okay, we see what you're doing. We see, you know, that you're not up to shenanigans here.
Right.
And that sort of knocked it open. And then at that point, you're sort of a made man. You know, they gave me what I really, you know, wanted to really have was access to their archives, because Jim's archives aren't in a library. They're not at University of Maryland or any place like that. They're privately held. They're inside the Jim Henson Company. So I really wanted access to those archives to get sort of that really good primary data. And you know, again, once you're in it, it's like being a made man. They gave me contact information for getting in touch with the Muppet performers, and, you know, gave me phone numbers to call people, and helped me get in touch with Frank Oz, which was one of my sort of must gets on this. So it was a 5-year process total, from the time I pitched, you know, came up with the idea to the time the book finally came out. But it was about 2.5 years of just sort of having these long discussions with the family and with the organization.
Wow. And I guess that's really the big pivotal thing, is if, you know, if you don't have access into the archives and the blessing of the family, it doesn't really become the biography that you really intended it to be.
Yeah, I mean, you don't always have to have that. You know?
Right.
But with Jim, you know, the guy, as I found out the person, like the guy just didn't talk a lot. So, you know, there wasn't a lot of things out there. So, you know, it was really helpful to have those, you know, that information, that stuff that he touched. So, you know, that was one of the things I really wanted to make sure I had, that I have access to. So, yeah, to do it right, I really felt I needed access to those archives.
Right. Now, you've mentioned before in previous interviews that you were 2 years old when Sesame Street debuted, marking you a lifelong Henson admirer. Before you were mature enough to understand the magic of the genius that was happening behind those creations, what was it in your personal experiences that drew you and kids your age to this revolutionary program that continues to go on 46 years later?
Well, see, but when Sesame Street came on, I mean, I was 2, but I was not the target audience. I mean, I wasn't reading quite that early, but I read fairly quickly. So when I would watch Sesame Street at age 3 and 4 and so on, I didn't really need it for the letters and the numbers. I could read and count, stuff like that. But I loved the Muppet segments. That was what I would tune in for.
Right.
And I have a younger brother, and we were, you know, like Ernie and Bert was our dynamic. You know,
Right.
The Ernie and Bert sketches, and we had these Ernie and Bert puppets, and we would try to reenact the sketches all the time, and you know, and I would always get to I always had to be Ernie. My brother had to be the straight man. And you know, and I loved the Kermit as the reporter, and Grover and Poor Mr. Johnson. You know, I mean, those were the bits that you live for. I mean, you know, when you're a kid. I mean, what's great about those routines is it's, you know, Jim was right. Like, kids were going to learn the material regardless, you know, what's the lesson in Bert sneezing his nose off? Well, there sort of is. It doesn't really matter. You know, someone would always say, what are we learning? You know, people would say, who cares? And that's sort of the great thing about Sesame Street is you were learning. Even through all this, you would learn about sharing, you know, and then they would give you that lesson in 8 seconds, and then the other, you know, minute and a half was just this craziness going on.
Right.
You know, Bert and Ernie learning about sharing by turning on the blender and the radio and the TV and blowing the fuse, and then you get their eyes lit up, and you know, there's great stuff like that. You know, why wouldn't you tune in for that? We used to tune in just to see the Muppet segments.
Right.
So, you know, I mean, it's sort of, you know, when you're it's sort of like growing up with, like, the, you know, the Roadrunner cartoons and things. You know, Jim had that very explosive sort of, you know, sense of humor. Somebody once asked me, you know, is there a sort of sadness to ending sketches with things getting eaten and things exploding? I said, you know, Monty Python ended sketches by dropping a 16-ton weight on people. It's the way to get out of the sketch.
Exactly. Go out with a bang, right?
Jim loved that kind of silliness, and that's really what, you know, came through to I think a generation of us. We were learning almost in spite of ourselves.
Right.
I think on these things.
Well, proud of his contributions on Sesame Street, Henson and his team, they were really fearful of being typecast as children's show performers, which would, of course, eventually lead to ABC exec Michael Eisner, who would go on to be the CEO of Disney, greenlighting a pilot for the Muppet Valentine's show. And then they would also make appearances on this brand new variety show called Saturday Night Live at the time, surprisingly enough. Can you talk a little bit more deeply about that doomed collaboration that would inevitably earn them the number 140 spot out of 141 on the Rolling Stone cast member list?
Yeah, and earned them no recognition at the 40th anniversary special.
I know, I noticed. I watched that whole thing waiting for a little clip and nothing.
Yeah, and they showed Gilda Radner with Scrad, and I really thought maybe they were going to show Jim next. They showed Bertie Brillstein!
Yeah.
Jim's agent as well. No Jim. I was appalled by tweeting that up a storm on that, and of course nobody was listening to me, but yeah, I found that probably fair enough that they finished 141 on there.
Yeah.
What happened with Saturday Night Live is Jim was one of their must-gets for Saturday Night Live. When they were putting this together, they wanted Lorne Michaels producing. They wanted Albert Brooks doing the short films, and they wanted Jim and the Muppets. Because the Muppets were your go-to. They were on every variety show throughout the 60s and on into the early 70s. Jim, as we all know, kind of on the side, knows they're going to work in a half hour if he can just find the right person for it. And he's still talking with Michael Eisner at this time and, still doing his pilots. But there's sort of a must-get. And for Jim, first of all, it was a real experiment in building. The Land of Gorge Muppets don't look like anything else Jim had really built up until that time. It was sort of his, he went into Michael Frith, one of his sort of master designers. And Michael Frith doesn't build, but he's a really great designer. And went to Michael and said, I need mossy. Doing these adjectives, but I need mossy, and I need, so he really wanted a way that to build these things that look different. He put taxidermy eyes in them. He hadn't really done that before. But Jim was really sense of place was always tough for him in putting together some prolonged sketches. It shows up, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, a little bit later, in his pitches for the Muppet Show, trying to figure out that sense of place. Where is this occurring? And so with Saturday Night Live, he was really trying to figure out what was it going to be. And so typical of him, he would get out a yellow pad, and he would write down scenarios in pencil. And he's writing game show. Are we going to do this as a game show? Should we do it as a fake soap opera? He's trying to come up with a scenario.
Right.
And the one he was finally happy with was mystic setup. And that was really all hero. Mystic setup. And so built these characters to come up with this mystic setup. Didn't really define what the rules of that world were. Sort of came up with the mystic setup, came up with these characters, and you've got the straight man and the bumbling guy and the weird wife and so he's got sort of these stock characters. Jim was always great at these these weird characters, and that goes way back to even Sam and Friends, coming up with sort of the weird characters that all play roles you expect, but they fill a niche.
Right.
So he's come up with these great characters, but they weren't permitted to write those sketches because they weren't part of that writing team. So they had to be written by the SNL team. And that was really where the bad fit happened. That's sort of the bad DNA in a sense. They all got along fine personally. There's the famous story that early is true about Michael O'Donoghue saying, "I won't write for Felt," and wrapping Big Bird's neck up in the Venetian blinds and hanging him in the
right.
but that allegedly really happened.
Right.
So it was a bad fit there. But they would write these setups, and if you watch them today, people are really split, I think, on Gorge. Some people still think they're hilarious. They definitely have that whiff of marijuana about them when you watch them.
Oh yeah.
Going on in pot and typical of the SNL writing team. So that was really kind of the problem. And the writers didn't know the rules of that world Jim had set up. So they were sort of writing somebody else's character. There was also a little bit of, I don't want to call it animosity, but you had people like Al Franken and Tom Davis writing those sketches, and who also wanted to be on the air.
Right.
So every minute you were giving to the Muppets was one less minute that you were giving to John Belushi and Gilda Radner and all these folks.
Exactly.
And Frank Oz loved. You talk with Frank Oz, and he's like talking about Danny and Johnny and Chevy. He's always calling everybody like Donnie, Stevie. He's always got that.
Yeah.
And loved hanging out with those guys. And so doing live TV was really exciting. They loved doing the live TV. And Jim would diligently show up every week to do somebody else's material, and was really trying to make it work. I think partly he thought maybe it was a leg into television again to try to get the Muppets established.
Right.
But clearly knew they weren't working, and I think Lorne Michaels knew they weren't working. Mm-hmm. And they probably weren't going to be long for that show anyway. But Jim ended up getting the Muppet Show right towards the end of that first season, and could sort of leave with his head held high, a little bit of dignity. And did actually write one of those last sketches where the Muppets sort of packed themselves up, giving them sort of the bow on the story of that. So you got to at least sort of define the ending of that. But again, the biggest problem with it was there was no real good fit between the Muppets and the SNL performances or the SNL writers. And Frank Oz said that it was different sort of in the way they looked at comedy. The Muppets were this very sort of slapsticky and explosive and almost cartoony, and the SNL was a little more improv-y, and so right. It wasn't necessarily a great fit.
Right. You just mentioned the Muppet Show, and that's a great way to segue into our next area of the interview. Every time it seemed the Muppets were finally going to get their prime time opportunity, there was always countless setbacks and non-believers that would push it back down. But as we all know, Jim was this eternal optimist, and he knew deeply that the concept would work, which brings Lord Lou Grade into the picture. Can you tell us more about Grade and Henson's relationship that would ultimately bring the Muppet Show to fruition in London on the bond of a handshake, really?
Yeah. I really wanted to call the book "Ridiculous Optimism" because
It would have been fitting, huh?
Yeah, because the Muppet Show really is sort of a study in perseverance and and stick-to-itiveness, and you can sort of you have almost three strikes because you have the two sort of not really failed, but the two ABC pilots that don't catch on, and then even that fantastic Muppet pitch reel they gave to CBS, which also didn't sell the show. So in a way, you got three strikes already. But Jim actually had a little bit of help from some behind-the-scenes guys, and I'm so sorry I can't remember the guy's name at the moment. But there was an exec at working in CBS who was looking for material to put into syndication, and was sort of scouting Jim and went running back to Lord Grade. And so there were a number of people who were watching Jim anyway. Jim was going out trying to get on TV. There were people in TV that were actually trying to get Jim as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was I believe his name's Abe Mandel. So there were people that were looking out for Jim and trying to make him sort of the offer he couldn't refuse, but were scouting him out. And so Grade was looking to keep partly for Lord Grade. It was a practical matter. He was trying to keep the lights on at Elstree, at the studios there where they filmed TV shows and did Morecambe and Wise, and I think Space 1999 had worked out there. So partly it was trying to keep the lights on at the studio, but he was the guy who really sort of got it. Lord Grade was an old style performer. He was essentially their version of a vaudevillian, and really got Jim's mentality and didn't look down on TV. That was one of the things. Like Jim really wanted TV to matter. Jim knew, Jim wasn't embarrassed by TV. And Lord Grade was never embarrassed by TV. When film came, started to really rise, Lord Grade was one of these guys who was, putting great people on TV and doing great variety shows, and really, would take film actors and put them on TV. Right,
like Judy Garland, he was responsible for.
If there's any loss of dignity in working on TV. So, he was a good fit for Jim in that regard. And the two really sort of got each other. They were gentlemen. They had sort of a similar sense of humor. They both believed in art. And one of the stories about Lord Grade that I love is, he was like, Jim knew how to make the Muppets work on TV. He knew how to maintain this illusion on television that they were alive. And Lord Grade had sort of come up through vaudeville and was famous for dancing the Charleston on a table.
Right.
And he would take this big oval table and he would turn it this way, so the short end was facing you, and he would dance on it. So it would look like this little teeny table, even though it was really wide because it was. So that was, this is a guy who knew how to use the technology to make it work for him. So it was a pretty good fit with him and with he and Jim. And so they had, I think it only took one meeting for them really to seal this deal with ACC. And Jim went running back to Frank Oz at SNL and said, we've got 24 shows guaranteed, and gave him a lot of money to do it. It was about $125,000 per half hour, which made it one of the most expensive shows on TV, not just in syndication, but on TV. It was a lot of money.
Right.
I'm going to film it in England, and very typical of Jim. He was always, he was notorious for this. Without even really talking with anybody, just sort of accepted the deal, and off they went to England to go film for 5 years.
Yeah.
And that's, it's one of those things like, people always talk about the French getting Jerry Lewis. The British really got Jim early.
Yeah, absolutely.
That show came on, and they went nuts for it, even before we kind of did over here.
Yeah, it kind of morphed from a cult before, it became a worldwide phenomenon, huh?
Yeah, but it took somebody who really believed in Jim and was willing to get out of his way. That was the other great thing about Lord Grade. Is Grade was willing to invest in him, and then was sort of willing to light fuse and back. And he would check in every once in a while, and Dave would tell the stories, but he'd walk in and say, "Everything okay, boys?" And would check in and then check out, and had his other shows to produce. Really successful guy, but recognized Jim's talent, recognized the potential, and recognized the advantage of bringing him and getting out of the way.
Right, the perfect kind of producer for creative types, huh?
Absolutely.
Over the course of your 5 years of research, you had the great pleasure of interviewing so many key people in Jim's life, and a lot of people that have since passed on, including Jane Henson and Jerry Nelson. In our research, we saw that you share this really heartfelt recollection of your encounter with Nelson on your website, and we'd love for you to share a little bit more regarding those experiences with these individuals.
Yeah, Jerry was a guy that I had been trying to get for quite a while, and the entire time I was writing, he was never really well.
Right.
And I had emailed him, and we'd gone back for a little bit, and we were having a hard time making it happen. And finally, I was at the they call it the Amphibian Alumni. It was like a Christmas party that the Henson Company was throwing, and I actually got invited to this thing, which was lovely. And while I was there, Karen Falk, who's the archivist of the Jim Henson Company, came running over to me, and she said, Jerry's here. And so she sort of brought me over to him, and he was in a wheelchair and rolling his oxygen. But I mean, my God, it's that voice, regardless.
Right. Yeah.
You know, he opens his mouth, and you're immediately, you know, 5 again. But I went over, and his wife Jan who's there, and she's lovely too. And so I just went over and I said, you know, I'm so sorry. I've been trying to. And he's like, no. I got your note, and I got your. We just haven't been able to. Let's set the date right now. So I'm standing there, and like we picked the date. I think it was in late January at that point to do it. So I flew up to Boston, and I was so worried it was going to snow. It was sort of like this time of year, and it had been snowing all winter, and terrible winter. And so I was going up there, flying into Boston, and there was snow in the forecast. And Jerry lives out sort of out on the tip of Cape Cod. So I rented a SUV in case I needed it, and drove out to his house. And it's this lovely little sort of shake shingle house up in Cape Cod, nice little piece of property that he's had forever.
Right.
And, you know, we swapped stories about, I live in an old farmhouse here in Maryland. It's always, you know, got something wrong with it, and pipes break and electricity blows out. And we were sort of swapping stories about, you know, he'd had problems with flooding in this house. So, you know, we sort of already had something in common, just the fact that we'd struggled with houses the whole time. And I sat with him in his kitchen for, you know, what I thought was going to be 1 hour, 2 hours, turned into 3, then 4, then 5. And just a really lovely guy. And we sat in his kitchen, and he had oxygen. He always was on oxygen, but he had the oxygen in another room, and he had maybe 100 feet of tube, and it was, you know, kind of under his nose that he would just drag around the house. So we sat in his kitchen, and you know, he made me bagels, and we had bagels and coffee while snow fell outside, and we just talked. And what I always told people when I came in, I said, you know, this isn't really going to be an interview. It's sort of like what you and I are doing now. It's a conversation.
Right.
Just sit and let's talk about Jim. And, you know, what was really sweet is, you know, he really, you know, misses his guys.
Yeah.
You know, he really loved that band. And, you know, Jerry had performed until very, very late.
Right.
You know, right up to the very end, up to the point where his shoulders were to the point he couldn't perform. He was doing voices and so on. But, you know, showed me, you know, photos of he and Jim at Disneyland. And just, you know, just a really, really neat afternoon. It was a really, really special moment, special place to be. And you know, Jerry was one of my people that confirmed confirmed my drug story that I had. And if you've read the book, there's one drug story in there. When I started writing this book, a lot of people said, "Man, you got to find out about Jim and drugs. They got to be doing so many drugs."
Yeah.
They were not. First of all, Jim doesn't have time for that kind of nonsense.
He was a very straight-laced guy, more or less.
He was straight-laced. Did, you know, smoke pot. That was about. And I'd like to drink the white wine, but you know, really didn't have time to be messed up. You know, it's in motion constantly. But anyway, everybody was saying you got to find out about the drug. So you know, I would ask around a little bit about that. But I found in the Henson archives a transcript of an interview with John Stone from Sesame Street, who reported a story about the story that's in the book, but John Stone had heard that story.
Right.
And so it was a reported conversation, and as a biographer, and you try to, you know, keep your standards, you know, relatively high on these things, you don't really want to do a reported story. You can say it's a reported story, but like when I found that, I was like, well, I got to find out more about this. Who was there? So I would have constantly asked people, who was there? And I found out it was Jim, of course, Jerry Jewell, Don Saline, Jerry Nelson, and Frank Oz. So that 3 out of 5 of those people aren't here anymore. So as soon as I got Nelson and I started talking to him about it, he's like, "Oh yeah," and you know, he gave me details in the story. So those little details that you see in the book, you know, come from guys like that. And Jerry remembered that story. Frank Oz remembered the story. So, you know, it was really great to go in, you know, sort of armed with information and try to see if people could remember these stories. And, and you know, the story Jerry really that still really moved him to even at that moment was he was the one that told me the story about the health insurance. How they were going to drop them because of his daughter's medical expenses. And he went into Jim and said, you know, I'm having to pay Christine. So, and Jim said, you know, we'll switch insurance.
Yeah, that's what insurance is for, right?
That's what he said. That's what insurance is for. You know, I don't know if that's an ad for Obamacare or not, but you know, he said, that's what insurance is for, Jerry. And you know, and Jerry, you know, 20 years on, was still incredibly moved by that Jim would, you know, change the entire healthcare plan for all of his employees, make sure they covered Christine Nelson.
It's pretty amazing to hear stories like that, and they're littered throughout the book, and it's just, I don't know if you really see too many people like that in the entertainment industry. I mean, it really just kind of is a testament to Jim's character and that, kind of one-of-a-kind personality that he had.
Yeah, it's one of those things that hurt my feelings terribly early on when people would say, "Oh, this has got to be a whitewash. Nobody's that nice." And look, God love Frank Oz. I was telling him this, and he's like, "That's bullshit." Frank Oz just explodes. And and the thing about Jim is he really is the way you think he is.
Yeah.
They're very, you can say Mr. Rogers was a Vietnam sniper. That doesn't make him one. And with Jim, you can say he's all these terrible. It doesn't make it true.
Right.
He really is pretty much what you think. He's got his weaknesses. He was not faithful to his wife.
Mm-hmm.
That's his big one. But Richard Hunt put it really beautifully at one point. He said he wasn't a saint, but he's about as close as you can get to one while you're still alive. So
right, very fitting. In preparing for our interview, we went back and, outside of your own book, we revisited a few things, including Henson's Place, the man behind the Muppets, which is, it's not only a wonderful time capsule of Jim and his team in the thicket of their many successes, but it's also a really human and honest look into the man and those closest to him. In many ways, it really began to scratch the deeper surface of what you would do ultimately 30 years later. Was this documentary as helpful and as enlightening as we suspect it was to you?
Yeah, I actually didn't watch it till very late in the process, I have to admit. I bought it when it came out on DVD, and it came out on DVD while I was in the middle of doing it.
Yeah, it's out of print now.
Is it out of print?
Yeah.
I've got it, but so yeah, I mean, it's always helpful. It's the Muppets Remember Jim Henson was available on YouTube in I think 9 parts, and I had downloaded all 9 parts and watched that. So you try to, it's because especially with Jim, because he doesn't talk that often. Anytime he does, you better grab it. So
yeah.
After when I watched Henson's Place, I went through and I was typing furiously to get some of these quotes down, because again, when you've got quotes from Jim, you better grab a hold of them.
Right.
So it was good for going back and filling in a little bit later. I'm not sure how. I'm trying to remember if I cited that. I'm not really sure. A lot of the stuff in there, I think I had covered someplace. But yeah, I mean, it was great to hear. I think there's stuff from Jane and people like that.
Yeah, Jane, Frank, Joan Cooney and stuff. It's just interesting because you kind of watch that, 84, so you're talking, Muppet Babies is just starting, Fraggle Rock, and you would immediately just pass it off as like, oh, this is going to be a fluff, everyone's kind of, blowing smoke up themselves, but it really isn't. It was a very honest kind of, depiction of what they go through and what it takes to do what they do. So it's, at that time, it was kind of a very adult outlook at, Jim at that time.
There was a great CBS 60 Minutes did a visit to the Muppet Workshop.
Right.
The Muppet Show. And again, thank God people are dumping this kind of stuff on YouTube, because I could go and find a lot of this stuff that was out of print, or, sometimes the Hensons didn't even have it, and they would say, oh, well, it's on YouTube, you can pull it down there. So it was, really great that people would put these things up. But, everything that's out there, you're always paranoid as a writer that you've missed something laying in plain sight, and people are going to say, I can't believe you could do this without ever having seen that. But I think with Jim's, I think I got most of it. I probably put eyes on a lot of on most stuff that was out there, and everything's helpful, and everything gives you context, and and that's always one of the most important things.
Right. Just kind of sticking with this documentary very briefly, there's wonderful footage of the now defunct Muppet Stuff store that existed in the city from 1980 to 93, fully dedicated to selling Muppets, Fraggles, Muppet Babies, you name it, and it really was like this place for every Muppet fan. It was like their mecca. Did you ever have the opportunity to visiting it? No?
Oh, no. I think when that was big, I grew up in New Mexico, which, was the middle of nowhere and still sort of is. So we didn't have, I could only read about these things.
Yeah, that was like a million miles away for you.
Well, if it was Los Angeles or New York, you might as well be Mars.
Yeah.
I remember reading about laser tag, in some magazine. I was like, oh, I'll never be able to play laser tag. So no, I never.
That's a bummer. Cement.
I never saw 117. That property had been sold ages ago anyway.
Yeah.
Time I was writing, I got to know people. They were working out of a workshop on Broadway that they had just sold that as well. Mm-hmm. So right as I was coming in, they were moving out to the workshop in Long Island City. So I never got to see any of these iconic buildings.
Oh, wow. Cementing their status as one of the most memorable duos of the entertainment industry, Jim Henson and Frank Oz were really the yin to each other's yang. Whether it was performing Bert and Ernie or Kermit and Miss Piggy, they just had this chemistry that was so key to many of their successes. Can you go into more detail about what these two shared together that just, brought unspeakable magic to so many people.
Yeah, I mean, what you see on screen with him and with Ernie and Bert, I mean, that really sort of is Jim and Frank's relationship.
Right.
You know, they both know how to push each other's buttons. You know, they both, you know, and everybody said, you know, Frank's very sort of uptight and buttoned up, and Jim's very laid back. And it's, you know, it's the design of those characters. Ernie's very horizontal, and Bert's very vertical. And that's why it's kind of funny that it actually took them a little bit of time before they figured out who was going to perform who. I mean, how could Jim have ever done Bert?
Right.
How could Frank Oz ever done Ernie? But you know, so you figure those things out, and they did. But that is their relationship. People called it, you know, a perfect marriage in every sense of the word. And you know, these are two guys who, you have to remember, Jim, you know, was a little older than Oz, and hired him right out of high school. So Frank Oz came in when he was 19 years old to right hand for Ralph. You know, really grew up inside the Henson organization, grew up with Jim, as you know, Oz said, it wasn't just under, you know, Jim's wing; it was in his right armpit,
right,
for his entire, you know, throughout his 20s and into his 30s. So Oz, you know, was one of these guys. He and Jim really knew each other's rhythms. They knew each other, you know, intimately, in every sense of the word. It really is. It was like brothers. I mean, who sort of know how the other guy's going to finish the sentence, know where the other person's beats are. So you know, it's when you watch them on screen, it's because that's the chemistry those two guys really have in real life. I mean, there's a reason, you know, Kermit and Fozzie are so funny together. Ernie and Bert are so funny, and even Peggy and Kermit. You know, this sort of frustrated one-sided marriage. I mean, that's, you know, Oz of course would never have that any other way, I don't think. So,
right.
So it really is just two guys. You know, I said to Frank Oz, you know, people call you guys Abbott and Costello, Lauren. He's like, no. You know, he's like, we weren't really a comedy team. We were just two guys who knew each other's rhythms.
Right.
You know, he saw it as very, you know, matter of fact almost. You know,
yeah.
Of course it works on screen. We know each other's rhythms. That's the way it works.
Yeah. Very matter of fact.
Oz is you know, he's you know, arguably probably one of the best puppeteers in ever.
Right.
And to this day, still doesn't really feel it's something a grown man should have ever been doing for a living.
Yeah.
When they called it wiggling collies, and you know, but only Oz could have done Yoda at the time.
Right.
But Jim was one of these guys who, you know, was like, Frank, come, you know, enjoy this. This doesn't happen in time. You've got the biggest show in the world. You should enjoy being on the biggest show in the world.
Right.
Jim, at one point, Oz said to me, I feel like such a name-dropping phony, but
it's fine. It's good for context for everyone.
You know, but he said to me, why does anybody care what I think? I don't know why anybody even cares what I think. And I said, well, you know, Mr. Lennon, this is a book about Mr. McCartney. You know, so you can't do one without the other. You know, you're pivotal to the story. You're critical to that story. Your view matters in this.
Right.
So he's very modest in that sense. I mean, he knows he's great, but, you know, he's like, I don't understand why people care. And he just, you know, he's such an important part of the story. The way he and Jim interacted really is what Jim always said. Oz is what made the Muppets funny.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's true to some extent.
Definitely. You know, once again, it's emphasized so much in the book, you know, Jim's optimism and his astounding work ethic, commuting from country to country during most weeks, sitting in on meetings and rehearsals, and still being a really dedicated family man. Everyone would think Jim was machine-made or something.
Right.
When speaking to his immediate family, what did you take most from their life growing up with a husband and father like Jim?
From the kids, they all said the best way to be with him was to work with him.
Right.
So anytime there was summer vacation, I think they were in that workshop. They were in London. They were working with him. Brian Henson, still to this day, great performer, loved getting his hands dirty in that workshop, going in and building the puppets and doing. Cheryl loved to sit and write. She helped him write Dark Crystal. You know, she helped him. She wanted to sit and write things. And she was a great designer too. She liked to build puppets.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Lisa, she's a little more of the. You know, the production end of things. But she, you know, they all said to a person the best thing to do was just hang out with him, work with him. And David Laser said that, you know, his favorite child was always the one who was right there with him. You know, the one right in front of him was always his favorite.
Right.
So he was always focused on them 1,000%. Heather Henson talked about him being incredibly over the top when it came to vacations. He loved to go hot air ballooning in France and, you know, do all these sort of, you know, rent a boat and go around the islands in Greece and things like that.
Right.
So you know, they all loved to be around. They all thought he was a great dad. John Henson told me a really lovely story about, you know, Jim, and it's in the book, when he was in his accident.
Right.
That terrible truck accident, and Jim dropped everything and flew back from England to be there. And John said, you know, he dropped everything. He was just a dad. He came over there, and of course, why wouldn't he? But
yeah.
They just said, you know, that was typical of him. He just, He loved being a dad.
Yeah.
Did he love being a husband? That's a bigger question. He and Jane, some people told me it was admiration at first sight for her. And she was one of these people that, again, knew his rhythms intimately. There's a reason that was his first partner. I mean, she's fantastic. You watch those Sam and Friends clips, my God, she's brilliant.
Yeah, yeah.
If you watch the I've Grown Accustomed to Her Face clip where Yorick eats Kermit, that's Jane doing Yorick, and she's fantastic. She's got great timing. She's a great performer. You can see why Jim would fall in love with that talent.
Right.
But Jim, from an early age, had very fast hands. Everyone told me, was a healthy male. So, yeah. Jim was not always faithful to Jane, and felt really guilty about that.
Right.
Tried to keep it on the DL and tried to keep it out of the papers, and everybody in the organization knew about it. Everyone talked about it. It wasn't. It's
kind of amazing that, a whole organization and Jim being as discreet as it was, that it never kind of got poured into the media and stuff. Not like today, where people would know about this 3 days ago. It's
and Jane's the one that even told me a lot of stories. Jane clearly knew what was going on. Was very open and honest about it, and said there were moments in when he was in London when word was starting to get around, and he was horribly embarrassed by that. He did not want that to be his reputation.
Right.
So so this is a guy who was clearly conflicted by this. It didn't necessarily change his behavior, but was very conflicted, slightly embarrassed by it. But tried to keep it as out of the papers as he could. Yeah, I do wonder nowadays if people would have sort of reveled in trying to bust him, if TMZ would have been looking for him or something.
I'm sure they would have. What better satisfaction to bring down the Muppet Man.
Yeah, but Jane, to her credit, again, very, very honest about it. Clearly, she was making no bones about it. She was the first one to, drop the name of Marianne Cleary to, one of Jim's, his girlfriend after they were sort of separated. But, they all knew what was going on to a person. All 5 of the kids knew what was going on. They all had stories. They knew it was going to be in the book. To their credit, they didn't try to change anything. The book isn't authorized in the sense of they had no editorial control.
Right.
They did see it, and they could fact check me, but it wasn't authorized, and so I know that was very tough for them. It's really hard to hear a stranger tell you your own story.
Sure.
And reading about stuff like this, I know had to be tough. And so, to their credit, they let it sit. And every person I talked with, had a story. They all knew about it. It wasn't anything that was terribly secret, but it was. So that's probably Jim's Achilles heel.
Right.
Is that? But as a husband, I think Jim really loved the idea of family. He liked to be able to come home to the family, come home to the house, and have dinner, and have crafts going on, and have the kids around, and have the pets, and have the dogs. Mm-hmm. And I think he really wanted Jane to be happy. Cheryl said that he really wanted her to be happy. He just couldn't make her happy.
Right.
So that's the sort of tragedy, if you will, in Jim's personal life was marriage. And again, there was still a lot of respect there. They never were divorced during his lifetime. Now they probably would have been. They had sort of they called it a handicap separation, but the paperwork was huge. It wasn't. Right. There was no hands. There was paperwork. But they were probably moving towards divorce had Jim not died. But they were legally separated for quite a while. I mean, that's sort of very Jim. We'll get there. Let's just get all the paperwork.
Yeah, exactly. As we kind of settle down on our discussion with the Muppet Show, I just have to say, it was a huge success and obviously an enormous milestone in Jim's life. With its 5th season nearing, clocking in and around 120 episodes, Jim vowed that it would be his last hurrah with the show. Considering its popularity, could the show have lived on for more seasons, or was its conclusion entirely creative-based?
Yeah, no, I think he probably could have kept that show on as long as he wanted to.
Right.
Would the energy have run out? Probably. It happened with MASH.
Sure.
It's prime and sort of peter out. You sort of do the Seinfeld mode. You go. Jim was the first to go out. He was one of the first to realize, might as well quit while you're ahead. Mm-hmm. I think he could have gone on for several more seasons. But, Jim always said that, he's one of these guys who everybody called him creatively restless, which is a really good description of him.
Right.
Because, he had his eye on the ball, and then once he had that ball, he was ready to catch another one. Mm-hmm. So, he really wanted the Muppet Show on TV, and he really dogged that vision for a long time and went through sort of the 3 strikes and then finally got it. And by the time they were in the middle of production, Jim's kind of ready to start moving on to movies, So he was always ready to move on to the next thing, even after it's like a dog that catches a car. Once he's got it, what's he going to do with it?
Right.
Jim got the car. This is great. Now he's ready to get another one.
Exactly.
So, this is one of those things. Jim never had any problem taking it out on when he was on. He did with Fraggle Rock. Fraggle Rock probably could have gone on for several more seasons. And he was actually a little conflicted, which I'm sure we'll talk about when we get to Fraggles, about actually putting a definite ending on Fraggle Rock.
Yeah.
I think it was the right decision.
I agree. Yeah, definitely.
You wanted to keep that show in perpetuity, and you don't want a last episode if you're going to do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, something like the Muppet Show, I think he could have gone on, another 3 to 5 years with it at least.
Mm-hmm. As you just said, with the movies, with the television world conquered thanks to the Muppet Show, and he was still continuing his obligations with Sesame Street, Jim's natural instincts, of course, turned to the movies, and the Muppets' big screen effort, which Lord Great fully backed. Can you discuss the creative process in pushing those boundaries beyond simply doing just the Muppet Show on the big screen?
Well, that was really, again, very important to him. He didn't want to repeat himself. He didn't want to just do the Muppet Show on the big screen.
Right.
He wanted rather than he wanted to do something very different. He wanted to bring the show out into the world rather than bring the world into the show. He wanted them out in the real world. He wanted to know how they were going to play out there. He didn't want to just repeat and do like Mystery Science Theater 3000, the movie. It's basically an episode of MST3K on the big screen.
Yeah.
So, he didn't, which I love, but he didn't want to do anything like that. He thought it should do something different. If they're going to be on the big screen, let's use it all. So, the first idea was, again, with Jim always finding that conceit. What are we going to do? So they knew they wanted the Muppets in the real world, but that's and this footage is on YouTube if you look for it. Went out to make sure where they going to work. If you take them outside and sunlight is on Kermit or Fozzie, are they going to look weird?
Right.
Is this going to work? Can we pull this off? And Jim thought it might work, but they actually drove out in the countryside and shot some footage of Jim and Oz
with the cows.
With the cows, and
yeah.
Jim's just cracking up this cow. Yeah. And but I think that okay, this is going to work. This is going to work. So we can take them outside and it will work. Then it's an issue of how do you hide the performers and what's the scale of things. It's funny. You've got Kermit talking with a real live actor, and their heads are right here. And then you cut to a way shot, and Kermit's way down here. So it's one of the things you have to make the illusion work. And how do you use the camera to hide the performers? And how do you there's a lot of really cool low tech stuff that works wonderfully in the first Muppet movie. You would actually almost literally bury your performers. You dig a hole. Put the performers in it, cover it with dirt, stick their arms up through the hole, and film them.
Yeah.
Sequence with Rainbow Connection, that opening scene. How do you do it? He has to be underwater. Jim was underwater. That's the way you do these things.
Right.
So Jim really loved the challenges, I think, even of making the Muppets work on film. He always wanted the movies to have what he called those how they do that moments. Mm-hmm. And he actually would write that in his notes, how they do that. And so in the first Muppet movie, obviously it's Rainbow Connection with him in the swamp. But a lot of that movie is how they do that.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And the moment I love is, I always thought that the gigantic animal was a special effect, and it was actually just a gigantic head that they built. It's a real puppet. So, that's Jim saying, simple is good, and then building this gigantic animal head.
Right.
To Frank Oz to perform. That's Jim's idea of simple. And it all works.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So he loved the challenges of hiding the performer, and making it look convincing, and making them interact with real people in a convincing way, and knew it would work, and it did.
Yeah. Well, long before the Dark Crystal came to fruition, Jim flirted with the idea of making a non-Muppet Lord of the Rings adaptation, but he deemed it too epic for one film. Was there ever any preliminary work done on this great what-if project?
Not that I found, no. Jim had a lot of non-Muppet projects that never got off the page as well. And Lord of the Rings seems like it would have been a good fit for him.
Yeah.
Sort of taken the work that they put into Dark Crystal and done that Lord of the Rings, it would have been gorgeous. But it never got any further than just sort of thinking.
Wish list, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, agreeing with Lord Grey to deliver a Muppet sequel in order to make his long-desired fantasy film, The Great Muppet Caper was always held in really high regard with Jim because it served as his first role as a film director. You mentioned in the book Jim's desire for the film to be an homage of movie musicals. While all Muppet films, as we know, contain their fair share of music, Caper really becomes more of a comedic heist film. Was Jim's intent, fully realized in this production, or was it more or less recycled into what became The Muppets Take Manhattan?
No, Muppets Take Manhattan is its own thing. That's a lot of Frank Oz in that one.
Yeah.
and Frank Oz is banging master. Now it's Jay Tarsis, and it's for the same writers involved in both those films. I think Muppet Caper does exactly what Jim wanted to do. He knew exactly how that ending was going to look. He had that written down early. That's the one where they came down the parachutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he had written in like the first draft, parachutes, everyone sings as they come down. I mean, like he clearly knew how this thing was going to work from almost day one.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't find the name. The name was tough for him.
Yeah.
What they were going to call it. But no, I think Muppet Caper works the way Jim, exactly the way Jim wanted it to work. What he thought was really fun was having Kermit and all of them playing characters, having them be somebody else.
Yeah.
As well. So and there's great jokes in there about Kermit and Fozzie being the twins, and so I think Jim loved the idea of not only are they in the movie, but they're now actors playing other characters in the movie.
Right.
That was really fun as well.
Right. While simultaneously prepping the Muppet movie, Jim was actively building the bones of what would become the Dark Crystal. Akin to his relationship with Oz, Jim and fantasy artist Brian Froud's collaboration was really another match made in creative heaven. The innovative techniques implemented in its final product and its noticeably darker subject matter really continues to mesmerize viewers to this day. Can you guide us through this partnership that would just build this cult classic?
Yeah, Jim had been a big fan of Froud's work early. He had seen his work in some of his books that he'd done, and he fell in love with the picture of maybe you can put it up when you're editing this together. It's an explorer standing at the edge of a waterfall that's sort of cascading over an ogre, like a carving of an ogre head. Jim loved that piece.
Right.
And really, that right there sort of, that's almost the birth of the Dark Crystal right there. Jim saw that and just knew this is the guy he had to work with. Froud, on the other hand, really was trying to figure out how did he bring some of his drawings to life, and knew that Jim would be the guy to work with. If you want somebody to build this kind of stuff, this is the guy you need to work with. So it was like you said, it was sort of a relationship with Oz. It was these two guys who knew they kind of needed each other.
Right.
And were completely in sync with each other again, and it, on a different sort of level than the puppeteering level that Jim and Frank were. It was this very artistic level. So Jim loved the way Froud thought, loved the way he worked, and sort of put it. And Froud came very early on to the workshop in London to look at the Muppets and saw some of the SNL Muppets they had done and loved that style of building and loved that style of that look.
Right.
And knew that this was sort of that's when he knew Jim was kind of his guy.
Right.
So again, it's two guys that are really sort of in sync with each other, really admire each other creatively, and knew they both have very high production value.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So they know that he knows Jim's not gonna do this irresponsibly, and Jim knows that Froud's going to give him just great stuff, and if you give him an assignment, man, he's going to deliver.
Yeah, absolutely.
So so the birth of the Dark Crystal is just both of them trying to figure out a way to sort of creatively express themselves together in this effort.
Also around this time, team members that were working on the Dark Crystal were drafted by George Lucas to create the puppet of Yoda for Empire Strikes Back. Can you tell us a little bit about this early introduction between two of, easily the most inventive men of the 1980s?
Yeah, I mean partly it was just a matter of having a similar address almost. Lucas is across the street from Star Wars while they're filming the Muppet Show, and the TV studios and the movie studios are right across the street from each other out there.
Yeah.
And so Jim's working on the Muppet Show while they're doing Star Wars work across the street. So they were sort of around at the same time, but knew of each other's work. And these are both. They're so interesting when you line their two careers up together. They're both guys who think the same way and believe absolutely in investing in yourself as your best product.
Right. If
you don't have something, you build it yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
You find the right people to do this for you. And so when it came time to do Yoda, they really struggled with how were they going to do Yoda. Was he going to be a person? Was he going to be an animal in a costume? What are you going to do? And so I think this is why Yoda still. I almost think that the Yoda in Empire Strikes Back to this day is still the more pure version of this character than CGI.
Oh yeah. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with you there.
There's just something about the real thing there that makes it work. So anyway, when you finally decide you're going to make Yoda a puppet, George Lucas wanted the best puppeteer in the world. So he went to Jim, believing that Jim was the best puppeteer in the world. Well, Jim, being Jim, said, well, Frank's probably the puppeteer you want to do this. And as Oz said, it's not just puppeteering, it's acting. And he said it's a little bit of different nuance than just puppeteering. And also for Jim, it was more of a time thing. He knew this was going to be very work intensive, and he had other things to be doing as well. So, so this is a big assignment for us. But there's great photos of them looking at that head and and examining and trying to figure out what is Yoda. And Oz always said it was very critical to try to. Oz is one of these guys that loves to build backstories for characters, and so even before they had backstories for Yoda, Oz was trying to figure out how old is he. And he said once you saw that face, you knew. Oz is the one that came up with that syntax, that sort of inverted syntax. He said he thought he gave that character like majesty and school feel to it. So that's Oz sort of trying to build a character. But what I love about the building of Yoda is it really for Jim it was a tech transfer project. Like he really wanted to take building Yoda was going to help them build the Dark Crystal.
Right.
Because they were trying to get their hands on ILM. They wanted to see how these guys were working and how they built and how they did these things and how they made things small. And on ILM part and Lucasfilm's part, they were going to get this talent and people that knew how to build puppets and knew how to perform them. So it was tech transfer really for both of them. So we're both really getting a lot out of this. But what I love is, once it was finally done, as Frank Oz put it, it was still a special effect. It wasn't really a puppet. He said that the way the puppet was built, all the weight was here. Yeah. His wrist. It didn't carry up here, it carried here. So he said he couldn't work very long because all the weight was carried in the wrong place. It was made out of the wrong material. It wasn't the way you would have built a puppet out of something lighter. It was very heavy. Yeah. So anyway, but what that did was it showed them sort of how not to do it when they started working on the Dark Crystal. They knew, you couldn't use heavy rubber. Heavy rubber was going to wear down your hand, and it wasn't going to move the way you wanted to, and it was going to be hard to make a mouth work. So there was, again, a lot of tech transfer going on between that. It was a worthwhile project for both of them. Lucasfilm got Yoda out of that, and Jim got the technology he needed to make the Dark Crystal. Right.
As we close on the Dark Crystal, it's been criticized for its minimal plot, but, really intense detail to its visuals. And it wasn't an earth-shattering hit, but of course, morphed into the cult classic that it is today. As someone who experienced it theatrically in '82, how has the Dark Crystal aged, in your opinion?
Jim was right about the Dark Crystal, but just at the wrong time. Right. He knew people would get it. He knew people would understand it. It is one of those movies that, when you look at it now, it looks like a movie that was made within the last decade now.
Sure, yeah.
It actually is a little too artsy for the time. I told this to Henson. I said, I was actually part of your problem because I saw the Dark Crystal in the theater when I was 13 or something, and I didn't really get it either. Yeah. And poor Jim, he's out doing the press for this, and the first question is, where are the Muppets? I mean, the poor guy can't get a break. Everybody wants the Muppet Guide. He's trying to do something different, and they just keep trying to drag him back in to it. Jim really, that's a hugely important project to him. It was really the first time he was expanding out there. He was really trying to, become an artist and go out there and do these great things. And the poor guy, his fans like us, like me, were just trying to drag him back. Come back here to the safety of Sesame Street and the Muppets. But really important for him and for his artistic growth. But I think today, the look of that film, again, there's times you can't believe that everything in that movie's built.
Yeah, it's really just a one-of-a-kind kind of sight.
It looks gorgeous. I mean, there's stuff that looks like it would be CGI. And you would do a film like that today entirely in CGI, and it'd probably look exactly the same. Yeah. So, I think it holds up in that regard. Does it have story problems? Yeah, but, so does Pirates of the Caribbean. I mean, you can pick on anything.
Yeah. You can't necessarily, wipe it off as, all flair and no fluff, because there's a lot. It's just, it's got its story problems, but I mean, I don't think anybody could really go against, the look of it. I mean, it's a beautiful film.
Meet him halfway. I think if you're willing to meet him halfway, you're going to come out of that movie happy. I mean, it's nowadays, it's got a huge following. Yeah. People get it, and they get it the way Jim really wanted them to get it.
Absolutely.
Back in the 80s, people who got it didn't necessarily get it the way he wanted them to, and people called it it's an art film. And, again, it was, for him, it was the next stage. It was the next big thing. It was the way of using the technology. The fact that they didn't get it, that's what really bugged him more than anything else. Not that the story left them cold. It was just, I'm not doing the Muppets anymore. I'm doing something bigger. That's what they weren't getting. Right. That's really frustrating.
Exactly.
It made its money, it made it made money. It did okay.
Never one to think small. Jim's imagination would, of course, bring him back to television with Fraggle Rock, which it's crazy to think that it aired on HBO the way HBO has transformed over the years. With an agenda to reach an international market, Jim really wanted to change the way the world thought in a similar way that Sesame Street was, educating the young minds of tomorrow, with bright colors and, characters filled with optimism. Can you discuss how this project morphed into the success it became, but it also allowed Jim to kind of work on it, but then step back and kind of hand it over to the creative people that really ushered it in each week?
Yeah, I think Fraggle Rock is like Sesame Street Part 2.
Yeah.
Like Jim always wanted television to matter. He hated that TV got bum wrapped. That was one of the reasons he really wanted to do Sesame. He wanted TV to matter. Mm-hmm. And with Fraggle Rock, again, it's an opportunity to make TV matter, to do something on television that's meaningful and has message without being too heavy-handed. So, going into it, that's one of his big objectives.
Right.
And he assembled his team in his house over there in London, and Jocelyn Stevenson and Michael Frith and Jerry Jewell. And, kind of went in and really did say to them, let's do a show that will stop war. And everybody said only Jim was the only person in the room who wasn't cynical enough that he could actually get away with saying that. And, and Jim had written in a notebook, which you can actually get in one of the Fraggle Rock DVDs, there's a copy of it, sort of the ground rules of Fraggle Rock, like what the characters were and so on. But then was content to hand that off to the team and let them go seal themselves away and come up with the rules of the world. So again, that was, that's one of the reasons Fraggle Rock really works, is because it's incredibly well thought out. There's this great big thick binder that's essentially the Fraggle Rock binder, Fraggle Rock Bible. Mm-hmm. It has all the rules of the world and how everything works and what tools they use. And it's sort of Jim's mentality in the sense that when Jim was doing Dark Crystal, Jim knew the rules of the world. We talked about with SNL how the reason it didn't work is the writers didn't understand the rules. Because Jim didn't really have rules for that.
Yeah.
And for something like Dark Crystal, Jim knew how the world worked and didn't really worry about the story. But he knew if you cut down a tree, what the crosscut was going to look like and what a chair being built. So, Jim knew the rules of that world. Fraggle Rock was the same way, but he was content to let those writers build that world for him. Mm-hmm. So, Jim knew that it was going to be about 3 different sizes of creatures that got along with each other, whether they meant to or not. So Jim sort of came up with the conceit, but then let them, as we said earlier, light fuse and stand back. They come up with the rules, and Jim doesn't perform any of the main characters. He performs some supporting characters from time to time. So it really is kind of the first time Jim's letting sort of the next generation come through and take this over, and sort of, he's giving them the ground rules and his blessing, and giving them creative energy they need to go off and go do this. And again, it is the ability of a producer to stay out of the way.
Right.
Jim was really willing to let them go and do this.
Yeah.
And build it and do it beautifully. And I do love pointing out, as you were talking about the HBO, that was HBO taking a chance on its first original content.
Yeah, it really was.
In a way, that's what built The Sopranos and the Game of Thrones and all these things that HBO does. That if that doesn't work, Lord knows how long it might take for HBO to come back. I had HBO at that time, and they were movies and boxing was basically it.
Yeah, movies, boxing, and I distinctly remember on Saturdays they would have like a children's block, and there was Fraggle Rock, there was The Adventures of Tintin, very akin to like Saturday morning cartoons, and it's like, this is not the HBO that I grew up with.
Jim really helped them turn the corner, I think, without any of them really knowing that they were doing it. So that was, that's the first time HBO was willing to invest. We're not just going to show a movie. We're not just going to show something that was aired in London and bring it over here. We're going to have somebody create some original content for us and see if it works. And it did. And again, it's another one of those shows. Could Jim have done it for another 5 years? Probably.
Yeah.
Even then, it's got sort of that abbreviated 5th season because he was kind of ready to move on to something else at that time. So, it takes off the air and he says, it's a very nice show. That's very Jim word. He said that when the Muppet Show. It's a very nice show.
Yeah.
So that's, Jim always had that ability to walk away.
Right. Well, Jim would once again, of course, re-team with Brian Froud to develop another fantasy film, allowing him to hand over directing duties on the next Muppets film to Frank Oz, of course. This would cap off the classic Muppet trilogy, and Muppets Take Manhattan would, of course, do adequate business, but it would really be highlighted for a particular scene that depicts the Muppets as toddlers. This would be the small seed that would grow the great oak, and selfishly, I need you to tell me more about Muppet Babies here. And this was, the origins of a beloved Saturday morning cartoon that Jim, as you mentioned in the book, was originally very hesitant to kind of dive into, right?
Right, yeah. Jim wasn't sure that they wanted to be on Saturday morning. And he and Jerry Joel really tossed that around for a while. And it basically came down to, well, since everything's already there, we should be there. And let's do it the way we would do it. So, typically it had to mean something. But let's step back, though, to the film of that. That's one of those moments that I don't think they expected to kill the way it did.
Right.
It's another one of those how'd they do that moments, because those puppets are incredibly hard to work with. They're very small. It's how do you hide the performer? They really are almost like finger puppets that they're working with, really small. So that was their big challenge in that movie. That was one of the things they wanted to make work and did. And I don't think, as you said, it's the acorn from which the oak grows. I don't think they expected it to be as big as it was. There's a little bit of discussion inside the company over who really came up with the idea of the Muppet Babies, where they've been drawn earlier by Michael Frith, where when I asked Oz where the idea came from, his response was, who knows where these things come from.
Yeah.
So, but it is sort of one of these serendipitous things, and they built it and they came. So I don't really think they expected it to take off and for people to go for it as they did. I actually like Muppets Take Manhattan the best of the original trilogy. I think it's kind of the funniest one.
I think you might be onto something, because when it comes to the three, you always kind of, shift back and forth when you're watching. I'm kind of feeling Caper this year, that, but I gotta say, Manhattan's kind of winning me over the last few years.
Yeah, the movie poster of the movies that I have hanging up in my office is Muppet Caper, because that was directed by Jim.
Yeah.
That's his movie, and that was his first big screen thing. So I have that one hanging up in my office. That's my sentimental value one, and I love that poster. It's got Charles Grodin, though. Come on.
Yeah.
But Muppets Take Manhattan, I think, is incredibly clever. I think there's, I think Oz is doing some things very intentionally to sort of, poke some good fun at Jim, like, putting him in as the advertising man, which Jim had been an advertising man at one point. So I think there's a lot of sort of affection, a little bit of affectionate anarchy in there, as Oz might have said. So I really enjoy Muppets Take Manhattan. Watching them all three in a row, as I did at one point, that was the one I walked away. I think that was the one I laughed out loud at them.
Yeah.
But anyway, but they all have their great moments in it, and that was supposed to be their big moment in there. But I don't think they expected Muppet Babies to be as big as they were. So when they finally went to the cartoons for it, first of all, it was a marketing juggernaut even before it got to the cartoon.
Oh yeah, the demographic it must have been catering to.
Yeah, well, and it was. It's like they had the Sesame Street, but they hadn't had the pre Sesame Street kids. Now they had that. Now they had stuff for parents to put onesies on their kids.
Right.
Stuff. They were printing money off of this thing.
Oh yeah.
So I think that was delightfully unexpected for them. I mean, there is that great line where they in the book, I think it's in the book, where they talk about putting them on diapers and you're going to let people shit on my name. And then let them. So so it was one of those that actually Jim always wanted to make sure you maintain your quality when it came to merchandising, and because he did that, I mean, they were making money hand over fist, and because they were doing that, that let Jim do a lot of the things he wanted to do. I was sort of laughing several years ago during the Super Bowl when people were wringing their hands that the Muppets were selling Toyotas, and Jim Henson must be spinning in his grave that the Muppets were on commercials. Muppets have been doing commercials since 1957.
Yeah, it's not new news here.
This is the way Jim built, his Muppet empire, was because he had money from commercials and merchandising. He could do a lot of these things. He could go do something like Dark Crystal, and when the company fell into the hands of oh God, I'm going to forget his name.
Robert Holmes,
of course. When it fell into his hands, Jim was able to go in there and use that money and buy all his property back.
Right, and we're going to get to that in just a second. Actually, I'm glad you brought that up.
Merchandising juggernaut behind him. That gave him his creative freedom. All these things. So anyway, I jumped the gun on you. I apologize. But anyway, Muppet Babies. I mean, when it got on the Saturday morning TV, again, it was one of those things. Jim just couldn't put a cartoon out there. It had to be about something. So he said, let's make this about imagination and about the way, different views of the world can help you solve a problem in different ways. And, I mean, another huge unexpected hit for them. And, there's a moment in there, I think, when there's a TIE fighter, I think, and Lucas gave him that image for free. It's like people, like doing the Muppet Show, people fall over themselves to do the Muppet Show. If you could get anything on Muppet Babies, you were going to get it on. Because,
and that's like what, on top of the messages that it was, relaying to its audience, The characters were just funny, and it was just, all those pop culture references, like you said, the images of Star Wars or Star Trek that made it what it was, but then also, little did they know this is exactly why we'll probably never see it on DVD, unfortunately, but,
Right.
you just didn't see that. They would open a door and you'd see the rolling ball from Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it just, oh wow, it's Indiana Jones, that's so cool.
Yeah, and it's very fast paced. I mean, it's very now for the most part. That's Michael Frith. That's another one of those projects where Jim was content to let other people mind the store on that. So a lot of that is Michael Frith doing the heavy lifting on that, working with Marvel Productions. People forget Marvel Comics was involved in that.
Very unexpected collaboration there.
Yeah, but letting them do it, and just sort of sitting back and letting trusting the right people to keep everything moving in the right direction with his sort of general worldview presiding over this stuff.
Yeah. Before we jump into our next topic, just want to bring back up the Muppets Take Manhattan. I was, a few months ago, I was actually with Carol Spinney, and I had an old press book of Muppets Take Manhattan. And, just kind of a testament to, I guess, how that movie charmed people over. I brought it to Carol, and, he wanted to autograph it, but it took him about 10 minutes to autograph because he kept flipping through it and just kind of marveling at the memories. And he's like, I was in this movie. And I knew that, of course. And he's like, I think I'm in this, actually. And he brought me all the way to the wedding scene. He's like, there I am. And he just couldn't help but sign everywhere that he was, but just marveling at that. And I'm like, it's like the little scene that he had. I guess that production just really, won so many people over the experience.
Yeah, and that was one of the great things in doing this with everybody I talked with. I mean, I never, with one exception, nobody ever told me no. People wanted to talk about Jim and their time working at the and people would call me out of the blue. I was in the elevator at NBC one day. I wrote down 40 floors with him. I'm happy to share my memories of somebody was randomly in an elevator. And people wanted to talk about Jim.
Yeah,
they had really warm memories of him. They like Carol Spinney going nuts through that thing. People would sit down. And I would hand them, letters Jim had written and have them read it, and they would laugh at them. And, people really, it was really a pleasant place for them to go.
Yeah. As you brought up before, it was around this time that Jim would, of course, wrestle the rights back to the Muppet Show and its first two films from Robert Holmes' Accord of ACC for a pretty reasonable $6.5 million. Jim, of course, he brought the Dark Crystal back from them in '82 without much, issues. But this was a move that was pretty unexpected, but as Lisa Henson mentions in the book, it really, it was the result of this that kind of had them, keep the company going. Without it, there would be no company. So, can you really go into, the conflicting relationship between Jim and Robert and, the desire for him to bring his creations back under his control?
Yeah, I mean, all his life, Jim really, it really mattered to him who he worked with. He enjoyed working with people who got it. People, like Fraggle, people that shared his view, and people that were enthusiastic about the work and understood that work was art and art was work, and so on. So it was just one of the reasons he and Lord Grade did so well. Lord Grade got it. Lord Grade came out again, sort of English vaudeville. Really understood art. Really understood performance. Got it. Holmes' Accord came in, and to him, the Muppets are a commodity. They're a line on the page. They're in the ledger. And whether they're hemorrhaging money or not, he doesn't really care. And he's going to dispose of them the way he would in an oil field. I mean, to him, it's just business.
Right.
And that sort of management style really doesn't fit Jim very well. He doesn't really like that. I mean, you read quotes in the book when people talking about Holmes' Accord. There's, nobody's really got anything good to say about him.
Yeah.
He calls him a carpetbagger, I think. And, So that style really doesn't gel with Jim very well, but because Holmes' Accord doesn't get it, and that's what really bothers Jim. And so the two of them went back and forth quite a bit on the phone, even with Jim trying to sort of wrestle the property, and especially Dark Crystal at the time. He's trying to sort of rescue Dark Crystal, and Dark Crystal's in a little bit of trouble because the showings aren't going as well as he wants them to, and so Jim's really trying to get that away from him.
Right.
He's going to leave, Universal as the distributor, but he's really trying to get that away from him so he will own it outright. And, Holmes' Accord is one of the few people that can make Jim raise his voice. That doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
Holmes' Accord sort of go at it, and he ends up, meeting with him in person and, wasn't very impressed. And finally is determined to get all of his properties back and get all the Muppet shows back from them. and is ready to go in and essentially give them a cash deal on this.
Right.
And he's got Duncan Kenworthy running the numbers and trying to figure out, and and all the kids and even Jane were saying, this was Jim being crazy in a way. We were all really nervous about this. And John Henson said, I was convinced we were going to lose everything, and everybody was very nervous that this was going to be a colossal blunder on Jim's part. He was going to invest all his money and lose it. But for Jim, it's a no-brainer. He's investing in himself. And I mean, I love the story there. He essentially throws Bernie Brillstein's words back in his face. Brillstein was the one who years ago, when it came to Sesame Street marketing, said, if you market this, you'll have enough money to have to buy your own creative freedom. And so Jim goes in to Bernie Brillstein and he says, I have all this money for marketing and I'm going to buy my creative freedom. That's what you told me I could do.
Right.
And Brillstein kind of throws him his hand. So, he got me. That's exactly what all this marketing was for. So Jim can go in and rescue himself from this guy. So Jim goes in we look at it now, it doesn't look like anything, but, rescues the Muppet Show, all the rights, $6.5 million.
Yeah.
But almost essentially an all-cash deal. Which made it, I'm sure, pretty sweet for Holmes of Court. But buys that back. I mean, he was essentially buying his own freedom and as Lisa said, creating what is the company today.
Right. Yeah, it really paid off for them.
But incredibly ballsy. I mean, not a lot of people would invest that kind of cash in themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I guess the Henson and Henson company is all the better for it too. So that was obviously a smart move for everybody. This, of course, brings us to Labyrinth. By this point, Jim was in heavy development with the project, and, it's really interesting to note that for the character of Jareth, Jim was very set on casting Sting of the Police until John and Brian made the case as to why Bowie was the perfect choice. Was there ever any discussions between Jim and Sting, or was it just simply on Jim's wish list?
I think he was just on Jim's wish list,
It's interesting.
Yeah, but John was adamant that it was going to have to be Bowie. He said, Bowie's the artist. Bowie's, Sting's happening now. Well, a little wrong about that, but he said Sting is now Bowie's the artist. That's who you want. And
I could have almost seen it working. I mean, a little bit. It's so hard to kind of step back and think, what is Labyrinth without Bowie? But I mean, I guess Sting could have maybe pulled it off.
Sting, the way he looks in Dune, kind of.
Yeah.
You see him in doing that. Yeah.
Exactly. You go into a lot of detail in the book about Labyrinth's screenplay and the many fingerprints that were on it, with a handful of writers plus Jim and, of course, exec producer George Lucas injecting their own ideas. It would seem that Jim was more determined to flesh out a more solid narrative while continuing to push the limits of his puppetry. Were the negative criticisms on The Dark Crystal a direct result of this?
I mean, like Gene Siskel sort of was one of the reviewers that sort of called it out for he knew what the problem was. Gene Siskel, I think, is the one who knew that they were trying to do sort of an adult fairy tale and hadn't pulled it off. That it doesn't hold together, and it was sort of the first time Jim was really trying to be intent on that story, on that plot, and. But he had told Brian Froud at one point when they got ready to do Labyrinth, he said, well, the problem with Dark Crystal is there were no people in it, so we need to put people in Labyrinth. Well, that's not really the problem with Dark Crystal, So it was sort of like misdirection on that part, thinking, well, if we put people in this, it's mission accomplished and we solved it. Terry Jones, who was sort of the lead writer on it, sort of the first hands on it, really had sort of a different vision than later writers did on it. He really wanted sort of an Alice in Wonderland-y thing, and Jim really liked that. But then Elaine May got her hands. So there was a lot of give and take on that script. And there's parts of it that work really well, and there's still parts of it that don't. The whole bit about whether Jennifer Connelly is the weak link in there will be debated to the end of the movie now because she's got an Academy Award behind it. So do you say, well, she can't act? She's got an Oscar.
Yeah.
So, Jerry Nelson very bluntly said, I didn't give a fuck about it. You can believe that if you need. But, I mean, the opinion is very strong on Labyrinth, whether Labyrinth works. I saw Labyrinth in the theater in college when I was a freshman and walked out not sure it had worked. But I think part of it is because, again, it doesn't look like anything else.
Right.
It doesn't look like anything else. You come out of it and it's like, was it a music video? Kind of. Is it supposed to be fantasy? Yeah. Is it scary? Not really. Is it a fairy tale? Kind of. There's a lot going on in there. So again, it's another one of those movies has its huge fans again. I mean, people are like live tweeting. Labyrinth is on TNT tonight. That's live tweeted, and people are tweeting it all the time. So it's got it. It found its audience again the way Jim knew it would. It just took 20 years to get there. So like Dark Crystal, he was right at the wrong time. There's some people who think it's the greatest thing he did. So
I would say, I mean, personally, I think it's the strongest thing he did since the Muppet Show. That's just me, though.
well, the thing about Labyrinth too is it's another one of those that everyone said that was the closest one to him artistically. He knew exactly the way that movie should look, and that movie looks exactly the way he wanted it to. So when you know that, I mean, it helps you understand why he was so devastated when it didn't do well, because that's really his guts on the screen. Like it's his artistic vision up there. If it looks exactly the way he wanted it to look and people don't like it, it's no wonder he was devastated by that.
Right.
So it's one of those movies that like found its audience, but not during his lifetime, unfortunately.
Right. You brought up a really interesting and rather shocking reveal in the book where Maurice Sendak actually threatened Jim legally, claiming the plot of Labyrinth was really similar to his book Outside Over There. A lot of people claim that it was due to his close relationship with Jane, and this was just kind of a way of her coming to her defense. Can you shed any more light on that and Jim's really shocked reactions to it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I even said that in the book that Sendak was a little closer to Jane, and that was sort of Jim's vow. Yeah, I mean, you have to look at the timing on when it was released and so on. I mean, Jim would have had to have seen that book in pre-production to have lifted from it, which talking with everybody, they said he probably did.
Right.
So the timing still works. Still works against Jim, if you will. David Laser thought it was really unfair. David Laser is Jim's producer, a really huge guy in Jim's life, actually. I think doesn't get enough credit. I was really glad to sort of tease him out a little bit because he's really important to Jim's story. But David Laser is one of these guys who said, had it been the other way around, Jim wouldn't have cared. He said Jim was fine with people, being inspired by other people's work, and even if you were doing it obviously. So Jim was really hurt by that because he would never have stolen anybody's work. He would never have he would never have plagiarized anybody. He never would have stolen a plot. He could have been inspired by a plot. So he was, I think, really hurt and sort of stunned by Sendak's response. Was probably going to call his Fieries Wild Things. Backed off that after Sendak's shot, so there's no Wild Things in the movie.
Yeah, that would have been a little bit more blatantly obvious.
Yeah. But there's, when you're watching the movie, there's a pan across her bedroom, and there's some shots of some Sendak stuff in there that were put in there sort of as a make nice to Sendak. So, because he and Sendak had a relationship as well. They'd worked on Sesame Street together and, respect each other. But, again, it was, everybody thought it was probably that his, he was a fan of Jane.
Yeah.
And, didn't like where that relationship was going, and was sort of taking that out on Jim a little bit.
Yeah. I would just, as we talked about the Dark Crystal and it not really, catching on the way Jim did, Jim was really very devastated by, the down, the really negative reaction to Labyrinth, because he really poured his heart into it, and it really was the closest thing, to his original vision, as you mentioned. It of course has spawned on, to a really cult following. Do you think the critics were right at the time, or was it again just like the Dark Crystal, where it was just simply ahead of its time?
Gosh. I think the criticism level of that movie is fair, but I mean, it happens. It happens every. Movies like It's a Wonderful Life bomb when they first release. They're just they're the right movie for the wrong time.
Right, exactly.
So the criticisms leveled at that time are probably fair for that time. You watch Labyrinth again. I watched Labyrinth again, and I'm kind of like, okay, well, I can see why people would say there's an issue. And okay, there's a slow spot in it, but again, as we said earlier, you can say that about a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I think people tend to hold Jim to a higher standard. I think people expect great things of Jim. And he's his own. He's in his own way without quite meaning to, because he is who he is. You go in there waiting to have your socks knocked off.
Right.
When it doesn't happen, you're disappointed. Labyrinth has its strengths, and it still holds up, and it doesn't look like anything else, even today. Again, it's like with Dark Crystal. If you were going to CGI that movie, it would probably look exactly the way it does. It's
absolutely
brilliantly done.
Now we're going to get to a section where we're going to talk a little bit about some unproduced projects. As the 80s reached their finish line, Jim was involved in a bunch of things, from The Storyteller to A Muppet Family Christmas, which was a real homecoming for the Muppet performers. But in 1989, you mentioned in the book, Jim announced that he had begun work on a new, really wickedly creative Muppet movie entitled The Cheapest Muppet Movie Ever Made. From the sounds of it, this was pitch-perfect material for the Muppets to make their comeback, but it never came to fruition. Can you tell us any more about this unproduced effort?
Yeah, it was a script that Jerry Joel had been working on for quite a while. And that, and he and Jim had gotten to the point where they were sort of roughly storyboarding it. Even Frank Oz loved it. And Jerry Joel and Jim would go visit Jerry Joel out in California. They would sort of lay their storyboards out on the floor and crack themselves up at this. I mean, the idea behind it was that Kermit was supposed to direct the next Muppet movie and didn't want to, so he let Gonzo do it. So Gonzo had this huge budget and blew it all in the opening credits. Mm-hmm. So the movie was going to open with these gorgeous high-def opening credits, and then after that, the movie was going to start to go downhill gradually over the course of the film. So you're going to start off in widescreen, and you're going to move to 16 millimeter, and then 8 millimeter, and then into black and white, and then into a slideshow, and then into storyboards, and so until the very end when they were going to get corporate sponsorship, and the movie was going to finish in like high def.
Yeah.
And it was going to be like very obviously cheaply made. One of the ideas they'd thrown around, which I love, was you were going to keep seeing a street corner in another country, and it was going to be like the same corner. It's like if you were, in Italy, there was going to be like the Italian flag. It's like they would just dress the same corner.
It's like bringing Sesame Street over to every country.
They were going to just dress the exact same street corner differently every time. Like it would be very obvious it was the same corner. So they loved that kind of joke. There were going to be a lot of ideas in it that weren't going to be cheap. They were going to blow an island up. I mean, virtually. But and Meryl Streep was supposed to play like Miss Piggy's stunt double. So they had a lot of really funny ideas. So it was them sort of getting. It was almost like the Beatles after they do Sgt. Pepper, and then they're trying to do Let It Be to like get back to their roots. And so almost like this movie would have been like them getting back to that sort of crazy, almost like that late 1960s mentality. Almost.
Yeah.
Stuff's blowing up all over and things are eating each other. Like it would have been a very old school Muppet movie.
Right.
I think it would have been a great project, and it's still sitting there for Disney to grab if they want it, I think.
I hope that they do, because it really is. I mean, you hear that mentioned in the book, and it's just like, God, this just seems so ripe for it.
Yeah. I didn't ever have see the script for it, but there's a whole lot of different outlines.
Right. There was another childhood favorite and a grossly underrated film, at least for me, from Jim's career, called The Witches. Jim, he served as an executive producer, but little did we know the tension that really occurred behind the scenes on this project. Can you share the brief history about this project that left Roald Dahl, Jim, and even real-life Wiccans up in arms about it?
Yeah. Well, that was one of those that I don't think Jim knew what he was biting off when he got into that one. He was really intrigued by that project because it was building again. It was a really good creature shop project because they were going to build mice at various scales because one of the main characters gets turned into a mouse. So Jim loved trying to do something that was realistic with puppet. And so the mouse team was great fun for him. He loved doing that. And Wiccans were upset when they heard that Jim was adapting this book, and they were writing him letters saying that how you can't make us look bad, and please don't make us look bad. And so Jim was sort of going back and forth with the Wiccans and saying just trust me on this. And then he started going back and forth with Roald Dahl. Roald Dahl was very upset. I don't know why he would even give away the rights to this book if he was going to be pissed from day one.
Yeah.
They had changed the ending to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which he was never happy about. And so here they came again, somebody else. And he really had a lot of confidence in Jim. He thought Jim was sort of a kindred spirit, which he was. Mm-hmm. But Dahl was very persnickety in this and really wanted to be involved almost to an uncomfortable extent. It was really making poor Duncan Kenworthy, who was sort of on the ground running things, really miserable and sending copies of the script back with really helpful comments like awful written on it. And this is terrible. And just really unhelpful things like that. And show this to Jim Henson, and really mad and really sort of taking it out on poor Duncan Kensworthy. And Duncan, wisely or not, sort of and Jim was involved in this, just sort of let Dahl stew, sort of like respond to him. And he blew a gasket and threatened to withdraw all the support for the movie and actively campaign against it, and didn't like that they were going to change the ending. He said I've written kids books, I know how kids books are written, this is my ending's the best ending. And Jim kept saying we're gonna film it your way, we're gonna do one my way, and we'll find out which one works best.
Yeah.
And Dahl just made Jim absolutely miserable. And Jim didn't really like conflict, and especially creative conflict like that. So I was really trying to make nice with Dahl and make him understand that I know what I'm doing as well, but did change the ending where the boy changed back instead of staying a mouse, and which I think is actually the better decision.
Yeah.
But not happy about this. So
it's so interesting. It's really interesting because, as you mentioned, Willy Wonka, he wasn't happy with this collaboration. But when you go really far back to around World War II, his collaboration with Walt Disney trying to adapt a Gremlins story, it was like a match made in heaven. It couldn't have been better. I don't know if maybe it was Dahl in his youth working with somebody as majestic as Disney at the time, but of course that project never came to fruition. And I'm like, what happened to this guy years later? Like, it just became a big grouch.
Dahl didn't like, the director, and it just turned into a big, huge headache for Jim.
Right.
And so I think he bit off more than he could chew, but didn't expect the problems that he ran into. Most of which was trying to stage manage Dahl.
Right. Well, of course, bringing up Disney here, we kind of get kind of down to the wire here. For the better part of Jim's career, he was constantly compared to Walt Disney, and he was a lifelong fan of Disney productions and had a mutual love and respect for the organization, which would lead him to eventually joining the company. This would allow him to focus on the creative sides of things while business affairs were taken by other people. The Disney CEO, Michael Eisner, of course, who the ABC exec who greenlit the original Muppet pilots, was more than happy to have Jim into the Disney family. Can you discuss more deeply about this teaming, which would ultimately be plagued with a bunch of rough patches along the way?
Yeah, first of all, Jim was a huge Disney fan. Jim at one point in his career, in the early '80s, had actually considered buying the company. This is when Disney was kind of ropes, and they were being, their stock had tanked, and Jim had talked to Bernie Brillstein even about trying to come in and acquire the company. Didn't happen, but for a number of reasons. But Jim loved Disney. He really admired their craft and loved the Disney Imagineers, and loved Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So Disney was not certainly not the Disney we know of today. But Disney was not this monster corporation that Jim was worried about being a part of. Jim really loved and respected and admired Disney. So I think first of all, what prompted Jim to want to sell was not the failure of Labyrinth. Sort of the common narrative up until a couple of years ago was that Jim was so downtrodden over Labyrinth tanking that he decided to throw it all in and go back to Disney. I don't think that's what happened. I think it was actually the failure of the Jim Henson show, of the Jim Henson Hour for NBC, because he had gone back to NBC and done some TV, including The Storyteller, which was a gorgeous series, won him an Emmy. Nobody was watching it.
Yeah.
But I think he was creatively happy with that. But when he did the Jim Henson Hour, and that sort of fell apart, and it was really the first time the Muppets had sort of stunk up television. And I think that really spooked him. And part of the issue was Jim was a fantastic businessman, but he had gotten to the point in the late '80s where running that company with offices in New York, offices in London, I think was really starting to weigh down on him. And there was a lot of conflict going on, and there was a lot of East-West, London versus New York, tension going on, and he had the Creature Shop, which is sort of his own entity, which he loved that project, and so that's sort of all these different balls in the air. But running the corporation was getting to the point where it was no fun for him. Yeah,
he was spending more time on the business side than he was in front of the camera.
So I think once Jim Henson Hour sort of tanked, that was when I think that's when he realized that he was probably trying to do too much, and he was like, I've got to get out of the business side of this, and I just want to go back to being Jim Henson and having fun and doing movies and performing the Muppets. So I think he wanted to sell to Disney to sort of get out from underneath that side of it, get out from underneath the thumb, and sort of carry on the creative stuff. So one of the things he wanted to do, there were a lot of cool things that he thought he was going to get out of the Disney deal. He was going to sell for $150 million, which seems unbelievable now. It doesn't seem like very much at all.
Yeah.
And they were going to get him in the deal, which they didn't even get when they finally bought the company. But the only thing he wasn't going to sell was Sesame Street. And that was always sort of a bone of contention with the Disney company.
Yeah.
But so he was going to sell outright, probably in an exclusive deal where he would be attached to Disney for 5, 10, 15 years. But what he really wanted out of that was his own independent production company, where ideally Disney would pay all the overhead and all the costs of it, and he could just go in and play, sort of create a sandbox. They were giving him a corner of one of the Disney parks, of Disney Hollywood Studios now,
right,
where he could go and set up his own corner. And that's one of the real sort of heartbreaking what might have been, I think.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that next, yeah.
So he's going to get a corner of the park. But the other real big point for him is he wanted to make sure that Disney really understood that these Muppet performers were part of the deal. Disney thought they were acquiring the Muppets, the characters, and Jim couldn't make them understand that if you don't take care of the performers, if you don't take care of Jerry Nelson and Richard Hunt and Dave Goelz, you're getting a a toy box.
Yeah.
You're not the Muppets. And he was really frustrated with Jeffrey Katzenberg over this because Jeffrey Katzenberg just didn't get it.
Mm-hmm.
And was very frustrated that Katzenberg didn't value that as art. He was sort of, he wasn't quite the Holmes of Court mentality, but he was one of these guys that's like, this is the commodity, this is what we're acquiring. And Jim was really frustrated trying to make him understand that, you've got to protect those performers.
Right.
And so, and what Bernie Brillstein, and so Jim almost scuttled the deal a couple times over that. And Bernie Brillstein just kept telling him, just keep talking to Eisner. When things look bad, go talk to Eisner. And, and Jim was committed to getting this done because he said he had given his word. Or anything else. He had shaken Eisner's hand, and that was what was going to get that deal done. So he and Eisner were determined to get this deal to go through. And I think Disney learned its lesson in the way they acquire properties now, because they announced this thing, and then more than a year later, they were still working on it. Almost.
Yeah.
So it was almost like I think Disney learned don't announce until basically the deal's done.
Oh yeah. I think it's never, it's nothing shows that more than the Lucasfilm acquisition.
It's a huge announcement, and then there's like, okay, now that we've made the announcement, now let's go cut the deal. And it just took forever. And both the companies got along okay, but the Henson Company lawyers talked about basically being out-lawyered in this thing, and how the Disney lawyers would come in and they say, we need the safety certificate for this elevator in your brownstone. And they were like,
just microanalyzing to the core.
They were in the weeds immediately, and that just wasn't the way that Jim and his company operated. They were a very successful, independently held company operating out of a brownstone.
Right.
They didn't have production offices and things like that, so it was one they sort of got out-lawyered early.
Right.
Held their own, but it was a tough negotiation. And Jim, towards right even before the end of his life, he's almost sort of thrown his hands up. He was just saying he was calling it that goddamn deal.
Yeah.
People said Jim never swore, so he was really just ready to be done with it. I think
right.
He threw his hands up a bit.
As you mentioned before, Jim loved the Disney production, but he was also a noted visitor of Disneyland and Disney World, making the opportunity to design attractions in the parks a real dream come true for him. Jim's final production before his death would, of course, be Muppet Vision 3D, located in the formerly known Disney MGM Studios. Can you discuss more about the fitting finale to his legacy and, of course, the planned Muppet Studios land that never came to fruition?
Yeah, that is one of those, what might have been on that.
The artwork's amazing for that, just the preliminary work.
The great, he loved that great American or the great movie ride, and so he wanted to do the Muppet movie ride over there, where all the information was wrong, and you were going to be. He loved the dark rides. Jim loved the like the ones where you float through on stuff. He really loved. I think it's still there at Epcot. He loved the one in the Mexican Pavilion where you through the history of Mexico. He loved that. That was actually one of his favorite rides.
Yeah. I just did that last year for the first time, and I'm like, people don't even realize the great stuff in the World Showcase. Like, you got to go into these little attractions.
It's one of those little sleeper hits.
Yeah.
Jim loved that ride. So, he really wanted to do sort of a dark ride where it was crazy. And, they did some great production art on it. Michael Frith, again, pencil flying, just drew this gorgeous stuff with Muppets doing Peter Pan and people flying, through the walls and things, just really funny stuff. It was sort of Jim's take on Hollywood productions and things going right. Anything that can go wrong will. So that was one of the big rides he wanted to do. He was going to do Gonzo's Pandemonium Pizza Parlor, which is going to be almost like a themed restaurant, and of course Muppet Vision, Muppet 4D or 3D but 4D, which is still there. And that was one where he was very skeptical of 3D technology, and finally he'd seen Captain EO and finally went and said, okay, there you go. Now, because he didn't want to do a 3D movie unless it was going to work right.
Yeah.
Jim. And had seen Captain EO and realized you could make it work.
So. And I don't know about you, but does Captain EO hold up or what? Because I think it looks great in 3D.
I think it looks. I watched it again the other day, just the movie of it, and it's it gets cheesier and cheesier every passing year. But it just as an experience, it was fabulous.
It is. I mean, I think it's amazing how there's very minimal blur in it. Just of course there was a lot of chintzy 50s 3D effect. Of course the Muppets is like that, but the 3D value in Muppets and Captain EO, it's like, why can't 3D look this good now? Going one better than Captain EO was they figured out that one. We'll do 3D, but then when there's lasers, we'll flash lights in the studio. Right.
Okay, so that was cool. And so Jim's the one who says, well, okay, so if you're going to do that, when somebody gets out a squirt gun, let's squirt the audience.
Yeah.
It's like making it that fourth dimension. So that's what was really brilliant about Muppet 3D. That was the first time you were like, you're kind of like, oh, that's the way you would do this.
Yeah.
It's like you're gonna blow air on people. It's really well done.
Yeah.
And so that again, that's Jim. Jim loved that technology. So that's Jim going in and just having a blast with that technology. Jim loved the Disney Imagineers because they never said no.
Right.
There's a story in the book where he and Michael Frith were kind of walking through the park, and they said, "Oh, it's a shame that the view up here is being blocked by this pavilion," and the engineers were like, "Well, we'll take that down." That they just never said no.
Yeah, it was never no. How can we do this, really?
Yeah. Jim loved that. He loved going in to play with the Imagineers and pitching ideas to them and that give and take. Really, I mean, that's one of those things. Had they given him a corner of the park, I mean, he would have been like John Lasseter. John Lasseter is taking over.
Yeah.
Adventure now, and I think that's what Jim would have done. He would have just taken over a part of that. It would have been unbelievable.
That's why I was very hopeful when, we'll, of course, talk about it in just a little bit with the new Muppets movie. I thought that they were really going to kind of beef up the Muppets' presence in the park, but unfortunately that hasn't happened. But, it's one of those things that with so much renovation and new changes happening in the parks, I'm always very fearful and very protective of Muppet Vision because it's like, do you really want to get rid of that? That's Jim Henson's last project.
I heard that they just closed the one in California.
There's a frozen overlay, and I looked into it, and a lot of insiders have told me that it's going to be temporary, and probably in the summer it's going to revert back to Muppet Vision, so hopefully. It's very interesting, the difference of population. The locals in California, Muppet Vision is like a ghost town there, whereas in Florida, it's very popular, so it's weird. Very weird. There was a few other things in here through our research. Around 1990, Jim was planning a new Muppet TV series entitled Muppet High, depicting the characters as high school students from the 1950s. This, of course, was never produced, but there was some preliminary toys that kind of made itself out to the marketplace of Kermit in a leather jacket and a motorcycle, I guess, kind of gearing up for that. Did you ever uncover anything in your research about this?
No, not on that. I mean, there's a ton of stuff, a ton of projects that, again, are a couple of scribbled sentences that Jim was doing around the time of the Jim Henson Hour. Mm-hmm. Because his original vision for the Jim Henson Hour was that it was going to be like Walt Disney Presents. And the way he initially envisioned this is every week he was going to have 1 hour to do one thing. Instead, he made him jam everything into 1 hour instead. So there were a lot of really cool ideas about, there's that sort of Fraggle Rock origin story. That he wanted to do that. He wanted to do an Electric Mayhem adventure in Mexico. But they don't get much further than the titles. But Muppet High is one of them. There's an idea that he'd been playing with even as late as as early as the '60s that showed up again in his notes for Jim Henson Hour. That's a lot like the movie that's coming out right now. That's like inside the kid's brain.
Oh, Inside Out.
Inside, yeah. I mean, exactly. It's like when I was reading it, of course, it was like all I could think of was Herman's head.
Yeah.
You're probably not old enough for that. But a lot of really interesting ideas, and a lot of which don't have Muppets in. I mean, he really wanted to adapt A Wrinkle in Time.
Yeah.
There's a lot of little projects that he wanted. Those are the kind of things I think he would have done had he had his own production company at Disney. He could have been doing this for the Wonderful World of Disney, for example.
Yeah.
1 hour specials, and
right.
He had just a rough sketch of a guy or a story about a guy who got possessed or turned into a bowling ball at one point. It's just like weird, crazy stuff.
Yeah. Always just endlessly creative, always kind of...
Ideas were never a problem for him.
Yeah.
And Muppet High was just one of those many ideas he had was thrown around.
I have to ask you, of course, after negotiating the deal with Disney, Jim passing away, the Muppets and Disney wouldn't come together until 2004. But before that, Muppet films were being continued to get produced, including, of course, the Muppet Christmas Carol, which many people think is one of the best Muppet movies, directed by his son, Brian. Of course, you have Muppet Treasure Island, Muppets from Space. I'm just curious about you. What do you think some of the strengths and weaknesses are of these Jim Henson-less productions, and do you have any favorites of them?
Part of my with the Post-Jim is an age issue. I had grown up with Jim, and then I was 22 when he died, and had just gotten my first job in DC, so I didn't see a lot of the Post-Jim stuff. And then by the time I had kids, we were watching the Muppet Show on DVD at that point. So we sort of reverted back. So I haven't, I've seen a lot of the Post-Jim stuff maybe one time. And it was beyond the scope of the book. I didn't really cover a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
The biggest strength of, the Post-Jim projects, first of all, is you still have Jerry Joel involved as head writer on a lot of these.
Right.
You've got Brian Henson involved, who is a fantastic director, which shows in every inch of Muppet Christmas Carol. And you still have all the Muppet performers there doing their thing.
Yeah.
You still got Dave Goelz there and Frank Oz and Jerry. You still got the band together for the most part. So you still got Jim's sort of outlook informing a lot of those projects. I think of the post-Jim ones. I caveated that in advance, saying I haven't watched them a lot, but I think the strongest ones of Jim, the post-Jim, is Muppet Christmas Carol. Mm-hmm. And then I think Muppet Treasure Island right after that.
Yeah.
Muppet Space I think is okay. I think it was a mistake to try to give Gonzo an origin story.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I from the title, I'm like, oh, that's great. It's kind of natural to see the Muppets go to space or do something sci-fi. But when they started to carve that out, I'm like, I don't think I need that with any of the Muppets. I don't want to know that he's an alien. I kind of ignore the fact that they revealed that.
And you can't go wrong adapting Christmas Carol, but they do it so well. And and again, you bring in your ringers. You got Michael Caine.
Yeah, I mean it's amazing.
It's beautifully done, and most of these are done, as you pointed out, in alliance with Disney. So
yeah, it's funny in the interviews that I saw you do, you kind of were making mention of how it was such hard math to kind of make up of how long it's been since Jim passed. But today, as we sit here, it's 25 years since his passing now. 25 years, which is, like you said before, it's really hard math to do that. But his legacy still continues to go on. And now, of course, thanks to Jason Segel's obsessive love for the Muppets, he got his dream of pitching to Disney with Nick Stoller. And at least to me, under the fitting direction of James Bobin, the newest Muppets from 2011 was the highest grossing film of the series, earned the movie an Oscar for Best Song. As a devoted fan of this modern installment, how did you think that Segel and Disney handled Jim's creations?
I really like the Muppets a lot.
Yeah.
First of all, people are always astounded when you tell them that that's the only Oscar that the Muppets have ever won. Like, Jim never won an Academy Award, and people can't believe that Rainbow Connection didn't win.
I know.
And it lost to a trashy song. That's terrible. It lost to what? It Goes As It Goes from Norma Ray. I mean, hum that song.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I mean, it was great for them to finally get the Oscar, and it was so great that they acknowledged Jim when they got the Oscar. So that was awesome, first of all. But I really think the Muppets did exactly what Disney needed them to do, in that it introduced the franchise. It was, it's like we're in the age of the reboot on everything, with the Avengers and another version of Spider-Man, and we've done it with Batman. And as a Batman nerd, I love all the Batman films. So it really did what they needed to do, which was to get them out there again, so people knew who they were. What's funny about the Muppets is, I'm not sure that they really did need to be rebooted, because I think people do know those characters, but I think it felt good. It felt right to do that.
Yeah, it kind of put them out there on a really big scope again.
Yeah, and it got them in the theaters again, which they hadn't been for a long time. I think it did exactly what they needed to do. Did that? The second one was going to be where the rubber hit the road for a lot of it, and I don't think that movie killed the way Disney wanted it to.
Right.
Will there be a third one? I hope so. I don't know, but I'm with you. I'm a big fan of the Jason Segel one. I really think, I think he stuck the landing. Like, he got the sweet spot in the Muppets, which is really tough to do.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, it's not too crazy. It's crazy without being too crazy. It's sentimental without being too sweet. I mean, that's a really tough line to run, and I think he really did it.
Yeah.
Really great. And bringing in a new character, which people are always skeptical of.
That was risky. That was very risky, but it kind of paid off, and he's kind of been welcomed into the pack, which is very nice.
Yeah.
What's interesting, I think this was kind of across the board, but one common complaint with the film was that the human characters were given more spotlight than the Muppets. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Go back and watch some great Muppet Caper.
Yeah.
Muppet Caper is almost, I would almost say there's too much humans in the Great Muppet Caper. So I think anytime you pull the focus off the Muppets, people are going to complain. There's too much focus on the humans. So I don't know. I think for those, I think it's, I think it's on a par with the other ones. Yeah.
I guess with 2014's Muppets Most Wanted, they kind of went to rectify that, where it kind of felt more truer, where the Muppets were really in the front seat again. I kind of felt that it was a little really closely rooted to the Great Muppet Caper's tone. How did that film live up to your expectations when you saw it?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think it's more. Actually, I think it's closer to the first Muppet movie, where it was like one of those when like the celebrities made the cameos. You were like, oh, look, there's that.
Yeah.
Like, excited when the celebrity showed up. and they were playing different people, and oh look, there's Mel Brooks as the mad scientist. So that's what it felt like to me. I think that they did that very well.
Yeah.
And I love Tina Fey, and I love all those guys.
Yeah. Do you have any idea of where you would like to personally see the characters go next in any future installments?
It's one of those things you have to be careful with the Muppets because there's the sort of pure artistic view where it's like where the characters need to keep growing and keep expanding and so on. Well, the nice thing about the Muppets though is they kind of like they meet your expectations. Like you really want them to be those characters. You don't want to you don't want to do anything crazy where it turns out that Spider-Man was a clone and then you got to backtrack.
Yeah.
So you can't really do that with the Muppets. You can't be like, well, actually, Fozzie is, he was abused as a child, and so he became a comedian because he's crying on the inside. You can't, you can't mess with it.
Right.
So so I just I think what they need to figure out is, again, that sense of place.
Yeah.
Where do you send them? What do you do with them? When Jim was initially doing his Muppet Show pitches, it was always set around a theme of like Valentine's Day or Halloween. Like that was how Jim was trying to get around the issue of where is this taking place. He was trying to set it around holidays. They need to figure out what they're going to do with the franchise on that. Are they going to be a parody of other stuff? They're going to try to do something new. They've got to figure that out.
From time to time, because I think Nick Stoller was interviewed when he was doing the press for his movie Neighbors. Somebody had asked him about the Muppets, and he just I think he kind of forgot he was in an interview for a second, and he's like, I could just sit here all day and think of Muppet concepts. I think I'm going to, and it just kind of went off in a little tyrant. But, I always thought it would be pretty funny to send the Muppets on, like, a safari and kind of play with the whole out-of-placeness of them. Most of them are animals, but they've been kind of harbored under this Hollywood spotlight, and to kind of see them out in the wild and see just how out of place they are as their characters.
Yeah, or you run the risk of doing something too self-aware where you're like, they almost did it in the Jason Segel one. Where, do you put them in a situation where they're aware that they're puppets?
Yeah.
Do you do something meta like that or not? I don't know. I mean, you could do something really weird. You could do something really fun and weird with them.
Yeah.
As well, but again, you've got to be true to the characters, and that's really I think it's both the challenge and the easy part because it's like Frank Oz is always adamant that like the characters matter the most, and I think that really is true. If you screw the characters up, you're going to lose the audience because the audience doesn't want to see the Muppets doing anything too weird for them. The Muppets can do a lot of weird things, but you don't want them acting out of character in the middle of that. If you're going to have somebody acting weird, if you're going to have Kermit thinking he's an advertising man, you better have hit him over the head first.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's so the audience is totally willing to work with you, but that you cannot screw the characters up, and I think that's the hardest part of it.
Right.
Because we'll go with you wherever you want to go, but you got to stay true to the characters.
Right. I have to ask you, over the years, there's been a lot of attempts to tell Jim's life story cinematically. It really came to a head in 2009 when there's the much talked about Muppet Man screenplay kind of hit the blacklist of that year. It was based on very little facts and kind of told through, these kind of like, fog, glasses of just pictures that the guy found and mild information that he picked apart on Wikipedia, but it was met with a lot of enthusiasm, even from the Jim Henson company who snatched the rights up to it. Were you ever fortunate enough to read this script, and what were your impressions of it?
I have not read it. I haven't. Stephen Christie from Archaic Comics actually gave me a copy of it. But
really?
I haven't read it yet. I have it electronically, but I have never cracked it. I haven't read it
Yeah,
yet.
it just seems like they put, aside from all the legalities they'd have to do, it really puts Jim's characters in a very unfavorable limelight at some points, which sounds funny, but how would you like to see Jim's story told, and who would you like to play him?
God, I don't know. That's like the game you always throw around, like who would play who in all these movies. And I don't know, because my wife and I were even at one point trying to figure out who would you have play Jim in a movie, and I if they were going to make one, they'd probably put Tom Hanks in it.
Yeah. Well, he's already played Disney, so he might be out now.
Somebody like that. Daniel Day-Lewis could probably do. He's tall enough.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I've actually really thought about that, and I wish I had a cool answer, and I don't.
Yeah.
So I don't. I would love to see him get the full-on biopic treatment. I think he deserves it. I think he's totally worthy of it. I think his life's got enough going on. People are like, well, there's not enough conflict in his life. okay, maybe, but I mean, there's so much creative energy and so much like, I mean, it really is a story of like believing in yourself and stick to itiveness and like dogging your vision and
Yeah.
and not being not being stopped when you're told no 3 times, and when somebody acquires your property, you go buy it back from them.
Yeah.
There's a lot of really good there's a lot of really good tension in that way, but it's
Yeah.
not. There's not any like I was beaten as a child and
I was a drug user. Like, I don't think we need the biopic of, like, I think people are so accustomed to the biopic of, like, he's hit the riches, he's gonna lose it all, putting coke up his nose, and then he's gonna come back at the end for
There's not a lot of darkness to him. He really was kind of a, the guy didn't want a lot of conflict in his life, and wouldn't argue with people.
Yeah.
And so there's not a lot of darkness.
Yeah. Maybe that's what the world needs, though. They need a biopic that's a little bit more lighter than what we're used to.
I think a nice positive story. I mean,
Yeah.
there's something really warm and encouraging in the fact that this is a guy who got huge, making people laugh essentially. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. As we get down to our last few questions, we've mentioned him several times in our conversations about Jim and his respective work, but your current project is a biography on the recently retired George Lucas. Incredible story. Really excited about it. What effect has Lucas had on you personally, and what inspired his life projects to be your next creative effort?
Well, again, sort of like similar to Jim. I mean, I was 9 the summer of Star Wars. So I was the target audience.
You're that movie brat generation, huh?
Right, I was exactly, so it's like similar to Jim, where I was Sesame Street Generation 1. I was Star Wars Generation 1.
Right.
And I was one of those kids, and I always said this about even with Jim Henson. I watched every single making of project there ever was on anything. I watched them on the making of the Muppet Show. I watched it on the making of Indiana Jones. So it's like, I love all that kind of stuff. I'm a total. One of the reviews of Jim Henson said something about how I had a nerd's eye for detail, which is probably very true, and I think I'm flattered by that. So
yeah, very much so.
Yeah, so I mean that's the kind of stuff I really like the way creative people work and the behind the scenes stuff. And I always like for people to understand like this. People, when I was pitching Jim Henson, I was telling people the word that people use about Jim Henson is magic, and aren't the Muppets magical? And this is all magic. Well, no, it's not. It's really hard work.
Yeah.
If I hang a light with my hands over my head for 3 minutes, my shoulders are wrecked.
Right.
And these guys are performing with their arms in the air all day.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that ain't magic. That's work.
Oh, yeah.
So, so that was one of the things I wanted to come through with Jim's book. And one of the things I really love about this current project is just like, this is work. This is this guy's work. And it's the ability, it's sort of like Jim in the sense that this is a guy that has a vision and really is going to dog that vision. And he's going to be told no. And people are going to try to re-edit his films. And he's going to be pissed off. And he's going to start saying, and he's going to say, I'm going to do this myself. And if you're not going to give me, special effects, fine. I'll build special effects myself. You don't want to give me great sound? Fine. I'll build great sound myself. It's another of those guys right in sort of like the Jim Henson mentality of, I'm going to figure out a way to make it happen. I will figure out the way to make it work. And I will invest in myself, and I will build my own empire, which he did, in the same way Jim did. So in a way, they're sort of cut of the same cloth, which I really like.
Right.
And that was, Washington Irving, my first book, was another one of those guys, sort of cut of the same cloth. The first guy to make his living as a professional writer in, the 1800s. Had to figure it all out. There was no mass print. There was no huge publishing industry. There was no PR. This is the guy who's like, I'll have my friends write my reviews of my books, so I'll have great reviews that I can, this is a guy who figured it out.
Right.
I was fascinated by these guys that are sort of like, sort of these quirky, enigmatic geniuses in a way, who like figure it out, figure out the way to make it work, get into the system and break the system and rebuild it in the way that works for you.
Right. It's interesting because your first 2 biographies were centered on 2 creative geniuses who unfortunately are no longer with us. So how has this experience been having your subject present for your research? I imagine much, much easier.
Going from dead to slightly dead to very much alive. Yeah. So it makes it easier and harder. First of all, with Lucas, I don't have him. He's a guy that doesn't talk with people. So he very nicely told me he wasn't going to participate, which I guess is further than most people get. So I actually felt very fortunate that he had entered into a conversation with me. But having said that, there's so much stuff out there. The approach for this book is it's a very deep drill research, and I love research. I came out at I worked for 20 years. Well, I still work in politics. But my first real job for a decade, I worked in the U.S. Senate. And your job in the Congress is when something's coming up and you're going to go in and brief your boss, you gather as much information as you can and
Right.
you compress it down into 1 or 2 pages, and you go in and you tell your boss a story.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, here's what happened, here's what all these different people are saying, and here's what we need to do. And it was actually a great training for biography, and especially for a project like this. There's just so much stuff out there. And it's very different than Jim, because Jim, there wasn't a ton of stuff out there, because I didn't talk very much, and he also didn't live as long. So for this, and I've got a gigantic stack. You probably can't even see it. I have a gigantic stack of stuff on my desk here. And,
nice book. I have it too.
Yeah, I got. Yeah, this is the shooting schedule for American Graffiti. And I've got bookshelves full of stuff. There's just so much stuff out there, and so much great stuff to go through, and tons of documentaries and commentary tracks. There's just a plethora of information to go through.
Yeah.
And the problem is almost there's too much of it. So it's a real deep drill, but trying to go through it all and organize it, which is a lot of fun. But it takes a long time.
Yeah. It's like a treasure hunt, really. It's just you keep digging.
That's a really great way of putting it. And it's a fantastic subject, and I've gotten to talk with Gary Kurtz already, producer of Star Wars and American. So there's plenty of people to talk with. There's tons of resources, so it's a really fun research project just in and of itself. A great subject on top of that, but even the research is fun.
Did you have Gary involved with Jim? Because was he involved with Fraggle Rock? Is that right?
Dark Crystal.
Dark Crystal, right?
Yeah. So I actually didn't talk with Gary for the convention.
Oh wow.
So I got almost, I got so much stuff out of Frank Oz. I got so much stuff out of Brian Froud that when I started writing it, I almost had too much information to work with. So I didn't talk with Gary. That was one of those after the fact. I was like, oh man, I wish I would have talked with Gary Kurtz. So when I got ready to talk with him, I actually sent him the Jim Henson book, and he was like, oh yeah, this is great. So it was really nice to when I went back to talk with him, we actually at least had that much in common. We could talk about Jim a little bit.
Right.
But that is one of those that later on I'm like, oh darn it, I wish now that I would have actually gotten to him and put some in there. But
what have been some of the difficulties so far along the way with this new journey? Has it just been the plethora of research that you're going through at this point?
Yeah, I mean there's just so I've written 50,000 words and I'm not even to Star Wars yet. So that's I'm insane. I mean that's way too long. So
no, not for me. Just keep writing the way it is.
It's great because I found you find so many, if you know where to look, you can find all these great resources people have been used, stuff that ran in the Corpus Christi newspaper where George Lucas was in town promoting and talked to some reporter and some podunk. You can find great stuff out there now. So it's just there's so much stuff out there, and so much great stuff and funny stuff and interesting stuff and great quotes that it's hard not to use it all. Yeah. And my concern is always like, well, I don't want to leave that out because that's just so good. So I get it all in, and then I start doing my word count, and I'm like, I'm insane. It's crazy. It shouldn't. This thing should not be more than like 120,000 words, or it'll be too long. And it's almost 50, and I'm on chapter 4. I mean, I'm insane.
Well, I want to see the unedited version once it's done.
It's.
Lucas, an incredible person, a creative genius. He worked side by side with so many legends throughout his career, from Steven Spielberg to Brian De Palma, just some of his friends, Francis Ford Coppola and what have you. Have you been fortunate enough to sit down with any of these people, and how has it been, documenting any of these interviews so far?
Yeah, I'm still working my way through a lot of these, and I'm kind of doing them chronologically. So it's like I talked, for example, John Cordy. Mm-hmm. Who it was sort of his little company was sort of the inspiration for American Zoetrope.
Right.
So so I'm sort of picking up as I go along, and it's you're sending out emails and you're making phone calls. So it's all still a work in progress in that regard. It's still I like to say it's still early, but it's actually really not, because I'm supposed to deliver this in October. But we'll see if I make this or not.
As you said, it's kind of interesting, the correlations between Jim and Lucas, even so much to the head where Jim sold the Muppets to Disney and George doing so with the beloved Star Wars franchise and Lucasfilm, of course. How do you feel so far about Disney's handling of the series, and what are your hopes with the new films and everything that they have in,
I am so psyched for the next Star Wars film.
Oh, yeah.
I love J.J. Abrams.
Yeah.
Because when I heard that they were doing the Star Trek reboot, I was like, oh, come on. Really. And I went and saw the first Star Trek, and I walked out there and I was like, do whatever you want now, because I thought they killed
it. I've never as much. You're being interviewed by a place called the Pop Culture Playhouse, so obviously I'm a huge nerd on everything pop culture related, but I never really got into Star Trek. So seeing Abrams reboot or reimagining of it, I just like. I'm a fan. Am I a poser if I say I'm a Trekkie now because of that?
But but doing it where you had Leonard Nimoy involved, so you had sort of the hat tip to the old Star Trek, and you really explained why you were going to be able to scrap everything that had gone before. So, I mean, it was brilliantly done.
Yeah.
And now with the Star Trek, they've got the original cast back. I mean, it's a perfect storm. I think it's going to kick ass. I'm really excited for it.
Have you been following Star Wars Rebels by any chance, the Disney XD show?
Not really. I haven't had the time on that one.
Oh, it's great. It's great. Very good stuff. It's, it takes place between episodes 3 and 4, but, just the little things that they're doing, like the cartoon series here, of course, the new trilogy. I think that Disney knows what they're doing with franchise. I don't understand quite really why people still frown when you hear Disney acquire certain companies. I'm like, do you see what they've done with Pixar and Marvel?
Yeah.
And
they've got the resources behind it to promote stuff. I mean, it's a great partner. It's a great arrow to have in your quiver.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. Just to close off, when can we expect George Lucas, the biography, to debut?
Well, if I can hand it in time, it may be out next spring. We'll see what happens. So.
Okay, so we'll be sure to look forward to that in a galaxy near us around that time.
I have my signature line in my emails that say "Coming to a Galaxy," which is the line they used on the original promo in 2016. So I'm not putting a month in there right now because it could be December 2016. I don't know, but we'd like to. I would like to have it done this year. We'll see what happens.
Very awesome.
I've lost my mind. I'm writing way too long.
Well, we appreciate it. I'm sure it's going to be a great work, and we can't look forward to it enough. Once again, Brian J. Jones, thank you so much for spending the time to sit here with us at the Pop Culture Playhouse. Definitely be sure to pick up the paperback version of Jim Henson, the biography, May 5th of this year, and stay tuned for everything George Lucas related coming from Brian J. Jones in the future. Brian, thanks again for tuning in with us.
Hey, thank you, Mike. I appreciate it.
No problem.